Chapter 1089 A difficult decision. After sitting for a while, Klein raised his hand to rub his temples. He then stood up, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and went above the grey fog. He then conjured Gehrman Sparrow. By praying to Mr. Fool, he sent messages to Danitz and the hermit Katlia. The message for the former was to remind him to be careful of the secret order. Although he didn't believe that Zeratul would directly seek out Danitz, a person who had crossed paths with Gehrman Sparrow on the surface, there was nothing wrong with reminding him regardless. As a bizarro sorcerer, Klein had a certain level of understanding of the beyonders of the seer pathway. He believed that those who could truly advance to such a state were sufficiently cautious and careful. This didn't exclude certain oddities and exceptions, but it definitely didn't exclude Zeratul, who was at sequence 1. And in this situation, in the eyes of an angel who was in control of enough secrets, Danitz was more like bait that was deliberately thrown out to fish for certain targets. Therefore, it was highly likely that Zeratul would very carefully and cautiously avoid him. At most, he would send members of the secret order to do some direct or indirect investigations. By the same logic, the message that Klein gave the hermit Katlia had the same content. However, this wasn't the main point. The main point was for her to immediately contact Queen Mystic Bernadette, saying that Gehrman Sparrow wanted to meet her as soon as possible. In addition, he also informed the Admiral of Stars, something he wanted to delay till the next tarot gathering, that she was to decide if she wanted to purchase the Sequence 5 Druid and Sequence 4 Classical Metallurgist of the Planter Pathway. West of the Berserk Sea, Theros Island. Danitz, who was gathering clues about Vice Admiral Ailment, held a cup filled with golden beer when his expression suddenly became extremely complicated. "What's wrong? You saw someone and recalled an indescribable encounter?" Anderson shook the Lanti-proof distilled liquor in his hand as he teased the abnormal Danitz. Danitz gulped down a mouthful of beer and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand before saying with a somewhat depressed expression, "We have to be careful of secret order members from now on." Ever since he met Gehrman Sparrow, such words were a common occurrence for him. His initial reaction had gone from the point of panic to numbness and depression. He suspected that one day, he would be listed as being wanted by all organizations of different sizes, except Mr. Fool's organization. Anderson sized up Danitz when he heard that as he chuckled. "Sometimes, I feel that Gehrman Sparrow is more like a hunter than me." "Heh, so the two of you have a special method of communication. You don't even need to summon a messenger." Danitz was just about to say a few perfunctory words when a person from Intis rushed into the tavern. He held a telegram and shouted, "Fasak launched an air raid on Backlund. Lone has officially declared war." Declared war? Anderson and Danitz looked at each other. By relying on their pathway's characteristics, they acutely caught the scent of a large-scale war. Fasak attacked Backlund and Pritz Harbor, and in return, Lone has officially declared war. The 3 ironclad warship fleets weren't at the harbor, so there wasn't many losses. They're heading back to the Lone coast. Katlia's crew happened to pass through Oravi Island, and they had gathered all sorts of information from the telegrams. Just as she was thinking about how the pirate crew would react in the situation, she suddenly saw an endless grey fog and heard the word Gehrman Sparrow. "Be careful of the secret order members. Be careful of Zeratul." As someone from Intis to a certain extent, what caught Katlia's attention was something that with the least importance. And it was precisely because of this that she had no doubts about the word Gehrman Sparrow's request to meet the Queen as soon as possible. She believed that this was related to the secret order and Zeratul. Finally, she said the 2 potion names softly. "Druid? Classical Metallurgist." This Sequence 4's modern name should be the Ancient Metallurgist. It was previously called Human Metallurgist. Katlia subconsciously walked to the window and cast her gaze down. On these seas, which had a time difference between it and Backlund, Frank Lee and Artisan Sealf were leaning on the side of the ship, sunbathing. The former carried a relaxed expression and looked very pleased, but there was a pensive look in his eyes. It was as though there were still some problems that couldn't be resolved. The latter's face was pale, and his lips were quivering. Scattered over his clothes were mushrooms. "Druid. Ancient Metallurgist." Admiral of Stars Katlia repeated the 2 terms again, feeling as though something was pressing down on her. After about 10 seconds, Katlia adjusted the heavy glasses on her nose bridge and consoled herself. Mr. Fool didn't give any warnings. It means it's not a big deal. With this thought in mind, specks of bright light floated down, forming a staircase of light between the captain's cabin window and the deck. Katlia went down the stairs and walked to Frank Lee and Sealf's side. After a few seconds of silence, Katlia asked, "Frank, what are your dreams?" Only then did Frank Lee realize that his captain had arrived. With a push of his palm, he flipped to his feet. Dreams? This biologist thought about it seriously and said, I wish to be able to study the soil, the creation of objects, and crossbreeding techniques without restrictions, so as to ensure that humans will no longer be hungry anymore. Equality between people will be achieved. What you can do, I can do. What you can grow, I can also grow. Upon hearing this, Artisan Sealf slowly got up and silently crouched to the side, opening his mouth and vomiting. Frank Lee continued without being affected. In order to have such a world, one has to have sufficient food and resources, so I hope to create all kinds of creatures that can deal with different environments and conditions. Heh, everyone has their own tendencies. I prefer fish, beef and spores. Katlia finished listening to Frank's description with a deadpan expression. However, during this process, she repeatedly nudged the thick glasses on her nose thrice. After a moment of silence, Katlia asked, There's only one step left to your research now? That's right. I'm just short of a Dmid's ability for catalyzing it. If I can get the formula, help me make the Druid Beyonder characteristic I have into a mystical item, Frank answered frankly. No, I won't help you. You devil. The silently vomiting Artisan Sealf raised his head and shouted anxiously. Katlia watched this scene quietly. With a flip of her hand, she produced a gold coin. Ding! The gold coin flipped up before landing in Katlia's palm, heads facing up. I have the Druid Potion formula. It's from Gehrman Sparrow, 5,000 pounds, Katlia explained in detail, as though she was deliberately telling Artisan Sealf, informing him who the true murderer was. A look of pure joy immediately appeared in Frank Lee's eyes. He really is a swell guy. Captain, I've only saved up to 3,000 pounds. Can you lend me 2,000 pounds? Most of his previous savings had been used to buy the Druid Beyonder characteristic, and he had even sold some of his items. Katlia fell silent once again. A few seconds later, she nodded while Frank Lee's expectant eyes were on her. Okay. Northborough, Backlund Medical University's affiliated hospital. Eudora lay on the bed with a blank expression, lacking the vibrancy a young girl should have. She had woken up from her coma some time ago, but she hadn't opened her eyes. Thus, she heard the doctor tell her parents that the injury she received to her right leg from the air raid likely couldn't be saved. They had to be prepared for an amputation procedure. After that, she lay down in a daze, feeling as though there were many people coming and going one after another. Among them, the person who had originally only visited the student next door, the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation director, Audrey, indicated that she was willing to pay for the subsequent treatments after hearing about her. The school's chancellor, Mr. Portland Moment, had promised to create the most advanced and most convenient robotic limb for her to walk like a normal person. However, none of this dispelled the gloominess, heaviness, sorrow, and despair in Eudora's heart. She wasn't even 18, and she had yet to enjoy the beauty of life. But now, she was about to lose a leg and lose her dreams. Her family wasn't considered wealthy. Her father was the owner of a grocery store that believed in the Lord of Storms. He was violent, barbaric, and unwilling to reason with women. Her mother was timid and weak, and she relied on her father to survive. If not for the fact that her family didn't have a second child at home, Eudora wouldn't have been able to study at all. But even so, her father had chosen a place like the Backlund Technical School where results could be quickly seen. Previously, she had commented on how lucky she was that the Backlund Technical School had been turned into the Backlund University of Technology. Furthermore, she had passed the examinations and become a real university student. This made her smile every day as she passed the joy to the people around her while having the time to indulge in her hobby for poetry. Eudora's dream was to remain in the university and be a university teacher, finding a husband who loved her as she loved him. At the same time, she could constantly keep true to her pursuit of poetry, hoping that they would one day be published in magazines and newspapers. Now, all of this had been destroyed by a bomb that fell from the sky. It had been mercilessly and cruelly destroyed. After an unknown period of time, Eudora silently pulled up the blanket and covered her face. She let out a soft whimper that sounded like a baby beast. The crying didn't stop for a while. After a while, Eudora suddenly lifted the blanket and saw a black figure standing by her bed. Half of the black figure's face was covered by mushrooms, while the other half was covered in weeds. In the black figure's hand was a wooden cane. Eudora couldn't even scream. She felt like her heart was about to burst out of her chest. The black figure touched her with the tip of the cane. Eudora felt her heart return to normal while her right leg felt cold, as though she could feel her leg again. When she looked at the bedside again, the black figure wasn't there anymore. In her daze, Eudora moved her right leg and realized that it wasn't painful at all. It was as if she had never been hurt before. She pulled up the blanket again and covered her face. A few seconds later, there was a sound of disbelief under the blanket. It was filled with fear, but it was also mixed with crying that were tears of joy. Chapter 1090 Haunted Tales Nighttime. Pritz Harbor, in a cemetery in the suburbs. The people who died in the airship bombings had been brought here. The priests and bishops of the three churches were busy comforting the souls of the dead to prevent any anomalies from happening. In that short day, many wives lost their husbands, many children lost their mothers, and many families were down to a single person. Some of them loitered in the cemetery, some silent, others sobbing. Some even wept until they fainted. Wearing an ordinary-looking face, Klein stood among them and watched everything without saying a word. It was as if he had recalled the funeral he had attended before. While it was dark, he had just used life's cane to treat the injured in Backland and Pritz Harbor's various hospitals, victims of the air raid. He had also left behind a strange and horrifying urban myth to help him further digest the bizarro sorcerer potion. And he knew that, once such haunted tales spread like wildfire, Zeratul, who was in Backland, would immediately be able to understand what was going on. He would send his marionettes to monitor the corresponding areas. Hence, before the news spread, he relied on teleporting to travel to all the hospitals in Backland and Pritz Harbor, leaving behind all sorts of horror stories to treat patients with severe illnesses. When this matter spread, he believed that he would receive a great deal of feedback, allowing him to take a firm and huge step in the direction of completely digesting the potion. However, Klein didn't stop there. The existence of a conspiracy created by the Red Angel evil spirit, and the fact that Zeratul was in Backland, was like a guillotine hanging above his head, urging him to continue searching for opportunities. Hence, he came here to witness the grief of the ordinary citizens. After a moment of silence, Klein retracted his gaze and turned to leave the cemetery. After arriving at an empty spot, his left glove quickly turned dark blue, and slippery fish scales grew out. With a whoosh, the wind swept over, and Klein flew up into the air towards the harbor. In the sea beyond the land, the Sonia Sea fleet from the Fasak Empire was quietly waiting. It was as if they were prepared to launch another bombardment after daybreak, destroying the rest of the shipyards. Soon, Klein arrived above the harbor ruins and looked at the faint flames in the dark night. At the same time, his two marionettes had used flaming jump to rush over from the ground, splitting up into different hidden locations. From what he had heard and seen, Klein didn't have any doubts or feelings towards what he was about to do. However, he was still confused. Taking revenge on the invaders was a legitimate matter, but if he were to seriously injure the Fasak fleet, the happiest person would be the lone king, George III, the true mastermind behind all of this, one of the culprits who had pushed for war. There are too many principles in this world, but only those who have truly experienced it will realize that there are times when doing nothing is the correct path. It will fill one's heart with conflict. With a sigh, Klein turned his attention to the information he had received from the hanged man. The commander of the Sonia Sea fleet from the Fasak Empire was Admiral Igor Einhorn. He was a demigod from the royal family, currently a Sequence 4 iron-blooded knight of the Red Priest pathway. Through this information, together with the contents of the Red Priest card, more key points surfaced in Klein's mind. Iron-blooded knight can make women turn into men, and also make them have courage that is comparable to steel. Not only can they control multiple types of flames, but they're also masters in this domain. They can even turn their own flames into steel. On the Nepos, the flagship of the Fasak Empire's Sonia Sea fleet, a burly man with a thick beard more than 2 meters tall, Igor Einhorn, was sitting behind a desk. As he drank Sonia blood wine, he pondered over what to do next. After daybreak, Lone's airship crew will definitely attack. Their Pritz ironclad warship and the corresponding fleet will return soon. If they continue staying here, I'll be left in a passive situation. Although I'm an iron-blooded knight, allowing the entire fleet's power to gather onto me while distributing the damage, the commanding officer of the ironclad warship is most likely a demigod of the Arbiter pathway, or they have the corresponding Grade 1 sealed artifact, so it won't be easy to deal with them. If I'm not careful, they might be able to make use of the advantage of their fleet's speed and armaments. Retreating is the best option. After that, we'll continue attacking the coastal ports while the lone navy is damaged. Heh. This war is indeed a good opportunity to digest potions. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to become a war bishop before this. Otherwise, I might have a chance to advance to the level of an angel after the war. Sigh, only a war bishop can truly unleash the strength of an army. It's not like how I am right now, only able to focus power on myself. In the midst of Igor Einholm's thoughts, he planned on using the hidden connection between an iron-blooded knight and the soldiers that were under his command to inform his adjutant to pay him a visit, so that he could give the orders of performing a retreat overnight. Suddenly, he looked up at the door. Thump! There was a knock on the door, and it instantly reverberated in the quiet room. An advance warning before an attack. This thought flashed across Igor's mind and he became extremely tense. In a battle between demigods, setting up an environment, sudden attacks, and catching enemies by surprise was a good way to seize the initiative. It was a combination that could effectively defeat or even kill an enemy of the same level. On the contrary, it was very difficult to accomplish it successfully. Therefore, giving an advance notice before an attack was either a warning without any follow-ups, or it meant that the attacker's level and strength far exceeded the target. As a senior iron-blooded knight, Igor instinctively considered the worst situation. He immediately woke up every sailor and soldier on the Nepos to establish a connection with him. At that moment, the noise sounded again. Boom! This time, the knocking sound on the door was comparable to the loud boom of a salvo. It made Igor feel like a bomb had exploded in his ears. Under his high-strung nerves, he carefully listened to the commotion. This wasn't much different from the roar of a cataclysmic terror. In an instant, Igor's ears buzzed and he felt dizzy. He quickly spread out the damage and let every member of the Nepos hear a faint buzz. Then, Igor grabbed the fountain pen on the table and threw it at the door. This dark red fountain pen left afterimages along the way, like a cannonball that had been fired. To an iron-blooded knight, no matter how ordinary it was, it could become a terrifying murderous weapon through his augmentation. Boom! The door that was hit by the fountain pen cracked open, revealing the person in the corridor who had knocked on the door. It was a man in a black trench coat. His body was as thin as paper, and his face had no facial features. At that moment, the fountain pen had already exploded. The tiny fragments were like storms brought about by the sweeping of a machine gun. It embroiled the person who knocked on the door, tearing him into pieces of flesh and blood. Igor didn't relax. Instead, he stood up and looked around warily. He clearly knew that the person who had knocked on the door hadn't appeared. At this moment, the adjutant, whose bunk was diagonally across from him, opened the door and ran out. When he saw the flesh and blood on the ground, he said in surprise, "Admiral, what happened?" "There's an intruder." Before Igor could finish his sentence, his gaze suddenly froze on the adjutant. The adjutant retracted his gaze from the flesh and blood on the ground and slowly raised his head. There were no eyebrows, eyes, nose, or mouth on his face. It was the same as the person who had knocked just now, a featureless surface. Igor's heart palpitated, and his entire body ignited, transforming into flames that shot out in all directions. After the scarlet flames dispersed, they swept forward and surrounded the adjutant. The fire quickly spread, revealing the already charred adjutant. When the cold wind blew past, the adjutant collapsed into a pile of ashes. The flames didn't stop as they flew out of the room, one after another, forming a tall and burly Igor in midair. At that moment, he saw seagulls flying around him. All of them had a human head without any facial features, their heads bare. Igor let out a secret grunt as a blazing flame surrounded him before he sent towards the strange seagulls at high speeds. At that moment, he heard the sound of metal rubbing against each other, and immediately looked over with the help of the soldiers. When he saw this, his body suddenly turned cold. He couldn't help but feel a sense of horror. On one of the ships on the other sail-powered battleship of the Sonia Sea Fleet, the cannons seemed to come alive and had a life of their own. They turned around and aimed into the air. As for the cannonballs, they actively leaped into the cannons. Boom, boom, boom. The moment these shells were fired, they were struck by fireballs that followed different trajectories, exploding prematurely mid-flight. Seizing this opportunity, Igor quickly recited the honorific name of the highest commander in the Sonia Sea Theater, a weather warlock from the royal family. The ruler of the fog of the battlefield, the symbol of weather flux, the totem of the storm and lightning, the great Awatoma Einhorn. This was also the reason why it was difficult to kill a demigod of the same level when an advanced warning was given. They could always find an opportunity to seek help. Of course, the main goal of the attacker, Klein, was to create a bizarre scene to scare a demigod and help him digest his potion. He had no intention of completing the hunt. Upon seeing this, He hid beneath the water. Having achieved his goal, he immediately got Konas and Anuni to swap locations over to him and teleport away with them. As for Igor, he didn't let his guard down. He remained extremely tense and guarded against any possible attacks. Only when the angel responded did he truly heave a sigh of relief. Following that, Igor didn't let the fleet stay any longer. He abandoned the sail-powered battleship that had turned into an urban myth, and he left those waters. After a while, a seagull flew over and landed on the sail-powered battleship that had regained its silence. The seagull had obvious dark eye circles. It looked around and said in the language of humans, "I can smell the aura of a seer demigod." Chapter 1091. Asking himself. Backlund, East Borough, in a cramped rental apartment. Wearing a rather thick jacket, Klein stood behind a desk and looked at the glass window in front of him. He carefully sensed the speed at which the Bizarro Sorcerer potion was being digested. It's really fast. It's even more than the first 3 months of my digestion combined. However, there's nothing I can do about it. Before I received Life's Cane, I couldn't provide sufficient treatment. I have to make sure that the heart of the target can withstand the fright they experience, so as a result, I wasn't able to go to the hospital to create an urban similarly. If it wasn't for the fact that a war broke out, it would be rather difficult to find other demigods. Those whose whereabouts that I can confirm are mostly on their own home ground. To secretly invade and create a bizarre sense of horror will involve turning innocents into marionettes. Even if there's no other choice, I wouldn't have considered it. Klein shifted his attention away from himself and sighed silently. He then repeated a word in his mind. War. At this moment, the street lamps in the distance were lit up. East Borough was pitch black with the occasional policeman patrolling the streets with lanterns. In the past, these policemen wouldn't have been so enthusiastic. Now that the war had broken out, they had to carry out the corresponding curfew orders to ensure that there was order and security. War. Klein repeated the word softly again, and in a daze, he saw a part of the ending. The lone king, George III, has finally broken through the shackles. He's no longer worried that any of the 7 deities will strongly object to his apotheosis. He can officially push for the various rituals needed of Black Emperor. What follows will depend on himself, or should I say himself. As long as he can withstand the impact of the potion, and as long as he can maintain his rationality, he would be able to ascend to the divine throne and advance to sequence 0. The Einhorn family of Feysack used this war that can embroil the entire world to allow its key members to significantly digest their potions, and without much difficulty, they can prepare the corresponding rituals and allow their family's overall strength to be enhanced. As for Amon's brother, he can consume the potion during these tumultuous times and experience a transformation to become a visionary, allowing this world to have another true god. As Klein's thoughts drifted, a question suddenly popped up in his mind. Can I accept such an outcome? Can I accept such an outcome? Klein opened his mouth and slowly closed it. Everything he saw seemed to pass through the limitations of time and space before returning to another place. It was the extremely thick, slightly pungent, cold, and moist smog which was yellow and slightly iron-black in color which had permeated through the entirety of Backlund. It was the tramps who were suffering from ailments, hunger, pain, and cold before being pushed to the brink of death. He was also struggling to survive. For the sake of food, he pushed himself with all his might, not daring to slack off at all. Finally he saw the light of life. He bought his long-awaited ham, but in the hazy smog, he fell to the ground and never got up again. She was a hard-working widow. In order to survive and to provide for her 2 children, she had abandoned all her dignity and made herself a shrew that spewed vulgarities. With pain-ridden joints that suffered repeatedly from the invasion of the humidity on a daily basis, she supported a roof that could block out the elements. However, the roof had collapsed in the great smog. The child she wanted to protect had died in her arms. It was a young girl who yearned to study and fantasized about a bright future. She doted on her mother and her younger sister, working hard in the room that was filled with moisture, always carrying that tiny bit of hope. However, after the great smog, she was no longer able to see the future she longed for. It was a girl who desperately took in knowledge under the care of her mother and elder sister. She had gone through too much suffering, and she walked out of her predicament one step at a time, hoping to improve herself. She hoped that her mother and sister wouldn't tire themselves out anymore, and that she would have a chance to let her family of 3 to live an ideal life. However, all of this ultimately shattered. In that terrifying smog, this girl was left alone. No matter how much pain or joy she felt, she was no longer able to share it with her mother and sister. That fantasy of her family life never appeared, nor would it ever appear again. They were living beings that fell to the ground like straw, one family after another, one human after another. They would never be able to erase the pain in their bones. It was a student who clearly had a bright future, but only half of his body was left. His intestines splattered all over the ground. They were children who returned home from school, only to suddenly realize that they had lost their parents and had become orphans. It was the pain of writhing on the ground while crawling with great difficulty. He was an ordinary person who wanted to approach the future, but was powerless to swallow his last breath. It was the people in the cemetery who were so silent that it made one's heart ache, or those who cried until they fainted several times. It was a land stained with blood. It was the air filled with gunpowder. They were cold and ruthless shells. And for the mastermind behind all of this, the greatest murderer, he would step up to the divine throne over piles of corpses, only to receive cheers and escape his mortal coils. Can you accept such a development? Can you accept such an arrangement? Can you accept such an outcome? After a moment of silence, Klein suddenly spoke with a deep voice. No, I can't. This voice immediately echoed in the room. It was layered and interlinked. No, I don't accept it. There were still lingering echoes in his ears as the corners of his mouth curled up. Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh. The 7 deities already tacitly accepted it. What meaning is there even if you don't accept it? Once again he fell silent. After a long while, he finally exhaled and said to himself with a calm expression, even if it's meaningless, some things still ought to be done. In this world, how could there be many things that were guaranteed to succeed? That they were of value and be of use? The corners of Klein's mouth curled up. He looked away, turned around, and entered the room inside the rental flat. Although he had already made up his mind, he had no intention of doing it rashly. With his current level and status, no matter how hard he tried, it would be difficult for him to affect George Ill's matters. Other than throwing away his life, there wouldn't be any other outcome. Furthermore, if this resulted in chaos in the Lone Kingdom during a critical period of the war, resulting in the invasion of the Faesak army, then the deaths and injuries of the innocent would only be 10 times or even 100 times worse than the Great Smog of Backlund. All I can do now is make preparations. On the one hand I have to improve myself. On the other hand, I have to make more preparations and patiently wait for an opportunity. Klein muttered silently to himself. He found a black sticky blob and split it into 2 before smearing one half uniformly on a mirror. This was a way to contact Demoness Trissy. However, when all the black objects disappeared, there was still no abnormality in the mirror. There's no response. After being frightened by an angel like Miss Messenger, Trissy has already decided not to have any contact with Gehrman Sparrow. Klein sighed and walked to the bed to sit down. His thoughts quickly shifted to the reason why the Demoness sect had helped King George III. One of them is that the demonesses need a catastrophe to digest the potion and hold a ritual. The other is that George III has made a promise to them? He promised them that they could openly spread their religion? No, this should be something that the 7 deities wouldn't allow. Even if the Black Emperor is a sequence 0, and with the primordial Demoness and the true creator, they wouldn't be able to fight against the 7 deity alliance. Of course, after this war, the existence of an alliance between the 7 deities is itself a question. In that case, the 7 deities that know that George III is working with the Demoness sect shouldn't let him become the Black Emperor. The promise is for something else? The Demoness pathway has a true god, and there are very few valuable items left outside. Similar pathways? Isn't that the Red Priest pathway? George III. No, Amon's brother doesn't only know of the secret mausoleum needed by the Black Emperor from Blood Emperor Tutor, but he also obtained the angel-level Beyonder characteristics or Grade 0 sealed artifacts of the Red Priest pathway. With the condition that having a sequence 0 means no sequence 1, this is probably the greatest hope for the upper echelons of the Demoness sect to advance further. Yes, the primordial Demoness should also be very interested. This can explain why the Demoness sect is providing help. The Red Angel Evil Spirit is searching for Saintess of White Katarina, and it doesn't seem to be as simple as he said. No. He didn't say anything else besides using common knowledge and reactions to guide me into thinking that way. Klein's train of thought gradually became clear. He decided to use Saintess of White Katarina as a breakthrough point, making her his next target. However, before that, he had to listen to what Queen Mystic had predicted. He wanted to know what she was planning to do in Backlund from her mouth. Only by understanding the situation could he find and seize the opportunity. The next morning, the hermit Catlia conveyed the words of Queen Mystic Bernadette. Today between 12 to 12:30 p.m. at Srenzo Restaurant, Golden Theatre. It was the name of a private room. When Klein arrived at 11:55 a.m., he used an illusion to deceive the waiter, and he walked all the way to the room and waited patiently. After a while, he took out his golden pocket watch and opened it. With that, he put away his pocket watch and counted down to 10 silently. Then, he raised his hand and knocked on the door of the Golden Theater. At that moment, his marionette, Konas, was sitting on a bench across the restaurant and reading the newspapers leisurely. Anuni was with a group of students, giving off a flyer that promoted the evilness of Xueqi. Of course, the three of them would switch positions from time to time, making it impossible for anyone to make an accurate judgment. "Come in." Bernadette's voice came from the room. "Very impressive. I didn't notice anyone inside, nor did I notice anyone entering. Well, it's also because I didn't activate my spirit-body thread's vision." Klein mumbled to himself before turning the doorknob and pushing the door open. The first thing he saw was large swaths of gold before noticing the chestnut-haired woman sitting at the head of the table. Chapter 1092 Ridiculous People. Bernadette was wearing an Inta-styled blouse and was sitting there quietly. Her chestnut-colored hair was naturally draped over her shoulders, and her straight brows were spread out perfectly. She actually had the aura of a female professional from Earth, one that had been in a high position for a long period of time. The Emperor's sense of aesthetics still has quite the influence over Queen Mystic. However, it's limited by the environment around her, and it cannot be fully manifested. Klein took off his hat and pressed it to his chest. He bowed slightly before casually pulling out a chair and sitting down. With a sweep of her blue eyes that resembled the deep blue sea, Bernadette's gentle and calm voice rang out. "Why did you contact me so urgently this time? Aren't you a clairvoyant? Didn't you receive a hint of a revelation?" Klein subconsciously replied in his mind before he felt that he was being too arrogant. This should be the after-effects of interacting with the Red Angel evil spirit for too long. With his level, it would naturally affect the people around him. If he was willing, this effect would definitely turn into a form of corruption. Klein quickly did a self-analysis and made a judgment. He pondered for a moment before asking, "Have you attained what you wanted to achieve in Backland?" Bernadette slowly shook her head. "No. You can even say that I failed." "Oh." Klein used a tone to express his surprise and puzzlement. Bernadette glanced at him and said unhurriedly, "There's a strange name for the Sequence 2 potion of the Mystery Prior Pathway. It's called the Sage. To advance to this level, one has to prevent a disaster that involves a higher level of power." Sage. So that's where Sage of the Hidden Sage comes from. Klein was momentarily enlightened. Just as he was about to ask, he heard Queen Mystic continue, "I anticipated such an opportunity in Backland, so I came here a few years in advance to make preparations. I've recently been waiting for it for a long time. Unfortunately, I predicted that it would happen in the second half of this year. Last year, I wasn't in Backland at the end of the year, so I wasn't able to stop the Great Smog. And in this war I tried my best to do something, and I achieved something. But to my surprise, Xueqi directly attacked Backland with an air raid, and the disaster ultimately erupted." "That's why you said you failed." Klein nodded indiscernibly and said with a sigh, "I didn't expect the ones to start the war to be the Phasacians either." As he spoke, he sighed inwardly. The difficulty of Queen Mystic's advancement ritual was controversial. It all depended on one's luck. One had to know that before he became a demigod, Klein had already stopped the true creator from descending. He had saved Tingen and Backland, which were feats that could definitely satisfy the ritual requirements of becoming a sage. But under normal circumstances, there weren't as many disasters like these, and they weren't things that could easily be stopped. Just like the present situation, Amon's brother had planned for 1 to 2,000 years. Even if something went awry with King George III, war would erupt as he had expected. This was because the root cause of the uniqueness of the death pathway hadn't been resolved. This made him suspect that Mr. Azek's life in the northern continent had always been under the arrangement of Amon's brother. If not, how did he, who had lost his memories, escape from the sites of the various major churches without a shape-shifting mask? More importantly, it was unknown why Azek had used his real name in this life. And this wasn't something that was suspected by anyone, nor did it incur any investigations. Is this all part of your plan? Amon's brother. Upon thinking of this, Klein felt a certain trauma, a result of post-traumatic stress disorder. His body nearly trembled. He silently took a deep breath and looked at Queen Mystic and added, "This war involves the son of the Creator, King of Angels, and the true deities. It's not something you can stop. With Bernadette's knowledge and experience, she still had some changes to her facial expression when she heard the sentence. She repeated a few keywords in a low voice. The Son of the Creator. King of Angels. Deities. She wasn't too surprised by this, as if she had already made a prediction. However, even if she was a clairvoyant, she wasn't able to pry into the script, composed by Amon's brother. After repeating it again, Bernadette fell silent for 2 to 3 seconds before sighing to herself. So that's the reason. Klein adjusted his posture and thought. Actually, to you, this war is also an opportunity. Next, there will be many disasters, including the clashing of powers at the angel level. I believe that you should at least be in control of a Grade 0 sealed artifact. You can stop certain matters from happening at the critical moment. Of course, you have to choose a good time and method. Bernadette nodded gently and agreed with what he said. She also tacitly acknowledged that she possessed at least one Grade 0 sealed artifact. Of course, as the daughter of the protagonist of the previous era, as the child Emperor Roselle doted on the most, it would be unbelievable if her father didn't leave her 1 or 2 Grade 0 sealed artifacts. What was more important was that Bernadette was already preparing the ritual needed to advance to Sage. This meant that she definitely had the corresponding sequence 2 Beyonder characteristic in her hands. To a certain extent, it was equivalent to a Grade 0 sealed artifact. After tacitly agreeing, Queen Mystic Bernadette's gentle but emotionless voice changed slightly. However, I still don't like war, even though it will give me a chance. I once hated him and couldn't understand him. That's why I didn't call him father for many years. It's because he did too many things against the trend of the times and hurt the innocent. I couldn't accept my heroic father turning into a crazy tyrant. And now, through the answers from the entity behind you and my own investigations, I somewhat understand his situation. I understand that he was suffering from despair, pain, and loneliness. I understand him as a drowning person, only struggling on instinct. When Klein heard that, he sighed and felt his emotions in turmoil. In this world, the only people who understood Huang Tao, Roselle Gustav, the most were probably the 2 people sitting here. Of course, this feeling didn't stop him from sensing that Queen Mystic Bernadette's condition was a little different today. In the past few times they had met, this king's daughter had never said so much, nor had she opened her heart so directly. At most, she would play the tune of music, subtly expressing her sadness. After some thought, Klein pretended not to notice, and he asked, when did Hebe start changing? Do you think there was any prior warning, or something worth paying attention to? Queen Mystic Bernadette's deep blue eyes moved slightly, as though she had sunken into her trove of memories. After a while she slowly said, not long ago, he proudly said to me, haven't you always wanted to know what's surrounding our moon and other planets? In the future, our journey might be towards the Sea of Stars. The Sea of Stars. What's on the moon and other planets? As Klein pondered over Queen Mystic's words, he suddenly recalled a key phrase and something. The key word was cosmos. That matter was, Mr. Dorr had once told Emperor Roselle that once he had the ability, he could take a look at the moon. That would resolve many of his doubts. The Emperor finally went? That hysterical diary page, L, was written after this exploration attempt? He had unknowingly changed his personality, becoming extreme? Klein recalled the corresponding content. Under Queen Mystic Bernadette's gaze, he deliberated and said, at your level, you should more or less know that there's corruption coming from the cosmos. Bernadette nodded and didn't pursue the matter. It was as though she knew that Gehrman Sparrow wasn't sure either. She knew that only an angel-level demigod could detect and resist the corruption. After more than 10 seconds of silence, the topic was directed towards Klein's reason for being here. One of the reasons for this war is because the lone king, George III, discovered the 9 secret mausoleums left behind by the Blood Emperor, doing so with the intention of switching to the Black Emperor pathway and becoming a Sequence 0. As such, he abolished the Grain Act. Klein didn't care if Queen Mystic knew anything about these matters. He followed his own pace and roughly told her everything without missing out any key matters. Finally, he said, the Black Emperor does have the ability to revive, but once a new Black Emperor appears, the original entity would perish completely. The original entity here referred to Emperor Roselle, who might have succeeded before being assassinated. Sometimes, Klein even suspected that Roselle had intentionally given others a chance which resulted in him perishing on the spot. This way, when he revived from the astral world and regained his uniqueness and absorbed the 3 Sequence 1 characteristics, he would no longer absorb the characteristics of Knowledge Emperor, arcane scholar, and the characteristics of another pathway. He could make himself pure, thus, free from madness. This was a way to live through death, but the prerequisite was that Roselle's ritual had succeeded. He had died during or after the ritual, and not before the ritual. Queen Mystic Bernadette took it all in before slowly saying, "You want to stop George III?"
Yes.
Klein nodded frankly.
Why?
Bernadette pressed in an unperturbed tone. The corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he smiled. Some ridiculous reasons that aren't worth mentioning. Bernadette's gaze landed on his face for a moment before she said, "That's enough. I'm also doing such things for something that has slim chances, one that's almost impossible to happen. We can cooperate on stopping George III. We're all ridiculous people." Klein sighed and said, "I'll give you the method to summon my messenger."
All right.
Bernadette reached out her right hand and lightly tapped the table. The fountain pen that was originally placed diagonally in front of her suddenly jumped up, as if it was held by an invisible elf before writing fluidly on the paper. "This is the method needed for summoning my messenger," said Bernadette calmly. 1 Author's Note. From Chapter 715. Chapter 1093. The Angels of the Fool. Queen Mystic's powers are all very fantastical. No, fairy tale-like. Klein glanced at the fountain pen that was writing on its own. He took out a pen and paper from his pocket and wrote the incantation to summon his messenger. He also indicated that each letter delivery needed the payment of a gold coin. Right on the heels of that, he handed the piece of paper to Bernadette and took the other party's piece of paper. He quickly scanned through it. An invisible creature that roams the upper realms, a strange spiritual body that is friendly to humans, a messenger that belongs solely to Bernadette Gustave. There's a certain difference between this and a standard incantation, but it's essentially the same. Queen Mystic must have deliberately changed it to this to prevent others from trying out the summoning incantation and using the connection between the messenger and the contractor to lock onto her. For me, it doesn't matter. My messenger is an angel. Only she can threaten others, and no one can threaten her. Even if she were to meet Zeratul, she should have the ability to protect herself and escape. Klein mumbled inwardly and shook the piece of paper, igniting a scarlet-red flame. As she looked at the piece of paper turning into dark ashes amidst the flames, Queen Mystic Bernadette said without emotion, "What are your thoughts regarding the preventing of George Ill's matter?" Having already made some considerations, Klein deliberately spoke slowly. "First, don't be rash. Don't take risks that we can't bear. Don't hurt the innocent." If not for the fact that Queen Mystic Bernadette had mentioned earlier that she hated wars and hated harming the innocent, Klein wouldn't have said so directly to prevent exposing his weaknesses. He would have used a milder and more roundabout method to achieve his goal. Upon hearing this, Bernadette nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Then, there are only 3 possibilities. One is to destroy the ritual at the critical moment and let George Ill's advancement fail. The second is to attempt an assassination in advance so that he won't be able to hold the ritual. Klein deliberately didn't give his third idea as he first analyzed the viability of the first 2 possibilities. Assassination has an extremely slim chance of success. George III, or should I say, the one who will become Black Emperor, should be a sequence 1, so it's not someone we can deal with. Even if he has yet to advance to sequence 1, he will definitely have acted ahead of time. Once he completes the preparations for the ritual and consumes the potion, he will be able to quickly digest it and build a foundation for the future. Of course, even if this situation has a very slim chance of happening, that person must be at least at the sequence 2 level. Furthermore, the Augustus family definitely has no lack of grade 0 sealed artifacts. Together with the protection bestowed to him, it's impossible for us to succeed. Here he changed the way he addressed George III from him to him. After calmly listening to everything, Bernadette seemed to do an assessment. As long as we can create a good opportunity, a sequence 2 can also be assassinated, but at least one of us will die, or perhaps both of us. What she meant was that the grade 0 sealed artifact she wielded was sufficiently powerful, magical, and terrifying. However, if she wanted to fully utilize it, the price paid would be very high. In that case, there really is a chance. That's because I lied just now. If I really had to give it my all, I could still find Will Septon, Palaz Zoroast, and Miss Messenger to help me. I can let them use the yesterday once more charm to recover their normal states for a short period of time. The problem is that I don't know how much of a price needs to be paid, or what kind of effects it would have on the situation. I also need to consider if it would end up involving kings of angels like Ouroboros and Amon. It would be great if Mr. Azik woke up. With 4 angels and Queen Mystic's Grade 0 sealed artifact, as long as we create an opportunity, we can even place our sights on a sequence 1. Of course, the chances of failure are extremely high, since there's no way to sustain it for long. Klein's heart was stirred when he heard that, but he didn't discuss it further. It wasn't that he wasn't willing to be honest during the cooperation effort, nor was it that he didn't trust Queen Mystic. Instead, Willa Septon and Palaz Zoroast were being pursued, so once their whereabouts were exposed, it was very likely that it would lead to their deaths. This was something that Klein absolutely didn't want to see happen. He vaguely said, "If assassination attempt is the only solution left, I can invite at least 2 angels to help." This was referring to Death Consul Azik Eggers and Snake of Fate Willa Septon, who Bernadette already knew of. She could guess the latter through the drop of mythical creature's blood. Bernadette was extremely surprised. This is that entity's will? Without the consent of the fool, how could his blessed seek the help of an angel? He has tacitly agreed to it. Klein spoke the absolute truth. Queen Mystic's blue eyes turned darker. She didn't say another word and only nodded slowly. As for Klein, he brought the topic back on track. The destruction of the ritual might be relatively simple, but it has to be done at the most critical moment. Otherwise, it will only be delaying George Ill's apotheosis. He has already received the tacit consent of the deities, so he isn't concerned about that. Even if the mausoleum is destroyed, it wouldn't take long for him to rebuild it. And it being destroyed at the critical moment will cause him to fail at the advancement and lose control to become a monster. No deity would allow such a creature to roam the world freely. A deity's descent will definitely happen to kill it off. The problem is that, with a king of angels as reminder and help, George III won't take it lightly. He will definitely arrange for the most secure protective measures. The difficulty might only be lower than directly killing him. This requires us to gather intelligence as soon as possible and find an incisive angle to be used. And be it the first line of thought or the second line of thought, it's best that you advance to sequence 2 in advance and become a sage. Bernadette nodded slightly to show that she understood. She then said, "What about the third line of thought?" Klein was silent for a few seconds before saying, "If the ritual was successful back then and the Emperor had already advanced to sequence 0, then he would still have a chance to revive. As long as we could find the arrangements left behind by the Emperor before George Ill's apotheosis and allow him to return, the plot of George III will fail." He didn't use the word him to refer to Roselle as Bernadette did, to avoid exposing his identity. Queen Mystic's eyes clearly flickered before they turned dark and reserved. She opened her mouth slightly and said, "I'll hand over selected diary entries to Katlia." Klein didn't discuss the matter deeply. Instead, he smiled and said, "Actually, there's still a 4th line of thought." Bernadette's eyebrows twitched as she expressed her doubts. "That's to do nothing. Let George III hold the ritual and attempt to become a god while we wait for him to fail." Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh. The higher the sequence is, the greater the chance of failure. This was actually the truth. Even if there was the script, written by Amon's brother with the road to success completely paved, and even if George III had perfectly digested the previous potions, the odds of him successfully advancing to become a god didn't exceed 50%. Of course, what Klein said was just a self-deprecating remark. Queen Mystic didn't immediately respond. She looked seriously at Gairman Sparrow for a few seconds before saying, "The feeling you give off to me now is different from the previous few meetings. I'm taking advice from my psychiatrist." Klein smiled, describing himself as a very serious mental patient. Without another word, Bernadette retracted her gaze and looked at the fountain pen lying on the table. "Then, let's gather the corresponding information and maintain communication through letters." At this point, she paused for a moment before speaking again. Her gaze remained unchanged. "Actually, I'm wondering if he might have already been resurrected. It's just that he's still finding his past self. I'm not sure what details the Black Emperor's resurrection entails. I wonder if he really chose to be the Black Emperor in the end." Bernadette's voice gradually became ethereal and carried an indescribable feeling. As Klein listened, he suddenly understood what Queen Mystic was thinking or expecting. She suspected that the fool was the resurrected Roselle, suspecting that the Emperor had fooled everyone in the past. In fact, he had never thought of switching to the Black Emperor pathway. Instead, he had chosen another path. As such, he needed to find himself by seeking out his past diary pages and cards of blasphemy. "Unfortunately, I'm just Uncle Joe from next door." Klein originally wanted to say something cheeky, but his emotions gradually turned staid, making it difficult for him to force himself to relax. Without saying anything, he stood up, bowed, put on his hat, and left the room. After closing the door to the Golden Theatre room and taking 2 steps forward, he suddenly heard a tranquil and melodious tune. This melody was ethereal and carried with it a faint sense of melancholy. After pausing for a few seconds, Klein turned towards the hall and left with flaming jump. City of Silver, a team gathered at the city gate and was about to set off. This was the team that was headed for Afternoon Town to prepare the exploration of the giant king's court. Derek Berg was standing in the middle and was the second shortest person. In his hand was a bronze cross with sharp spikes. To his sides were Joshua and Chaim. They were prepared to receive the unshadowed crucifix at any time to prevent Derek's Beyonder characteristic from being purged. This sealed artifact required 3 people to take turns to resist the negative effects. As he looked down at the creator's relic, he suddenly felt someone looking at him. He subconsciously looked up and saw that it was a member of the 6-member council, Shepherd Elder Lovia. The woman, who was shortest in the group, had long silver and slightly curled hair. She was looking at the ancient mottled unshadowed crucifix with her pale gray eyes. Her gaze seemed to be blazing hot. Upon sensing Derek's gaze, this shepherd elder's lips twitched, revealing an indescribable smile. "This is the Lord's item." For some reason, Derek shivered. Then he heard the chief, Colin Iliad, say, "Let's set off." Chapter 1094 Breakthrough Point. In a small alley in the Backland Bridge area, Zio once again met the MI9 staff responsible for contacting her. "This is your reward from exchanging your merit points. A total of 2,500 pounds. Heh, I helped you get another 500 pounds. The golden masked man threw a bulging envelope at Zio. Zio caught it accurately and didn't count. She instinctively pressed down and sincerely said, "Thank you." The golden masked man waved his hand and said, "There's no need to thank me. This is also a good thing for me. If you continue to harp on past matters without letting go, I'm very worried that I'll go to military court one day. Are you still going to stay in Backland?" "Yes, I'm already used to living in a big city. When the war stops, I'll bring my family here," Zio said, having already made up her mind. "Wait for the war to stop." The golden masked man repeated Zio's words with a slightly odd tone. He smiled and said, "May the Lord bless us to live until the end of the war." Here the Lord referred to the Lord of Storms. "I believe in the goddess," Zio replied seriously. "You understand what I mean." The golden masked man waved his hand and said, "Are you still planning to take on missions from MI9? I won't reject an opportunity to earn money." Zio scratched her slightly coarse hair and said half-truths.
Yes.
The golden masked man nodded and said, "The main thing to take note of during the war is to deal with spies from all over the world. If there's a suitable mission for you, I'll look for you." "All right," Zio replied without staying any longer. She cautiously and carefully retreated out of the dark alley. After watching her figure disappear, the golden masked man looked at the shadow in the corner and said, "She was likely used by some particular faction. She was abandoned after she stopped investigating the matter." In the shadows in the corner, a deep voice sounded. "On the surface it looks like that, but there's no need to pursue or worry about the truth. Even if she can figure out the truth and spread it, it will not affect His Majesty's matters." Heh. The Church of Evernight has already tacitly agreed. "That's for the best," the golden masked man silently exhaled. After returning to her residence at the edge of East Borough, Zio said to Furs, who was sitting by the bed and reading the newspapers, "I received 2,500 pounds. Furs put down the newspaper, her eyes moving slightly as she focused on making calculations. "That's enough." Zio had savings of more than 600 pounds, and with the 2,500 pounds, other than her necessary expenses, she had 3,100 pounds to spend freely. And her purchase of the Judge Potion formula was 2,000 pounds, and the Beyonder characteristic was 3,500 pounds. In other words, she was still short of 2,400 pounds, something that Furs could lend her. After borrowing this sum of money, Furs's savings would be reduced to 780 pounds. However, this didn't affect her at all. She had the subsequent potion formula and main ingredients, so she didn't have many expenditures for a long period of time into the future. Occasionally, she could even earn a little from renting out Layman's travels.
Yes.
Zio nodded. "I'll complete the transaction as soon as possible and strive to advance to sequence 6 as soon as possible." Seeing that her friend's matter was settled, Furs turned to worry about herself. I don't know when my scribe potion will be completely digested. Now that the war has broken out, it will be much safer with the ability to travel. The crux of a scribe is definitely recording. When I become a judge, you'll have new Beyonder powers to repeatedly record. This should be able to speed up the digestion of the potion. Zio pulled a chair over and sat down. Furs sighed. I suspect that, other than the recording of Beyonder powers, I need to record down the sights and customs of different places. Only then can it be matched with the subsequent traveler sequence. But with war having broken out now, it's fine if I go further inland, but it will be difficult and dangerous if I go somewhere else. Sigh, the price of bread is rising. The price of 1 pound of bread has risen by a farthing. It's even more expensive than before the Grain Act was abolished. Indeed. Zio thought seriously and agreed with Furs's conclusion. The two fell silent. After about 10 seconds, Zio suddenly had an idea. Actually, there's a very simple solution. What? Furs sat up slightly and asked. You can spend money to hire that person to take you traveling. Zio was very careful not to mention specific code names and actual names. You can be thrown somewhere unfamiliar each time for 3 to 4 days, or even a week. Then, you wouldn't take long to record all kinds of customs and traditions. Besides, you can rent some mystical items from him. From them, to record Beyonder powers. This can both improve your strength and help your digestion. That's right. Fuzz's eyes lit up when she heard that. Only then did she realize that her usage of the tarot gathering was very superficial. After the pleasant surprise, Furs gradually frowned. This method meant that she had to frequently deal with the world Gehrman Sparrow, and the thought of the crazy adventurer left her trembling. Indeed, there's nothing that doesn't require a price. To digest the potion, I can only take the risk. Finally, Furs made up her mind to make the request next week at the tarot gathering. In an apartment several streets away from where Zio and Furs stayed. After returning from the Srenzo restaurant, Klein was sitting in front of a table. He quickly flipped through today's newspaper and summarized the important information he had received. The Fasak Empire's Sonia Sea Fleet has retreated from Pritz Harbor. Their whereabouts are unknown. The Ministry of Defense, Admiral Amirius, has indicated that he will strengthen the coastal defenses and allow the 3 ironclad warship fleet to not return too hastily, and will take detours to avoid being ambushed. Fasak's 2-headed giant army invaded the Winter County's Amantha mountain range and suffered intense resistance. They failed to pass through the few strongholds. Fasak's subjugation fleet attacked Constant and other large-scale industrial cities along the Mid-Seashire's eastern coast. There was a large-scale sea battle with the kingdom's Mid-Seashire fleet. Both sides suffered losses. East Balam's Fasak and the lone colonial armies are fighting in multiple locations. The rest of the countries have yet to make their stance clear. In the corresponding capitals, the ambassadors are running around to contact each other to have emergency diplomatic meetings. The electrical transmission waves contain all kinds of important news and are intertwining with each other in the different cities of the northern and southern continents. We are still in the early stages of the war. Klein didn't believe that the diplomats were able to avert the war. He put down the newspaper and thought about how he could gather information regarding George Ill's Black Emperor ritual. According to normal logic, before Blood Emperor Alista went crazy, he did things in a reasonable manner. That is to say, he couldn't build all 9 mausoleums in the same hidden area. This would have been easy for others to wipe them out all at once, causing his resurrection to fail. Therefore, in the surrounding areas of Backland, in other parts of the kingdom, there should be 8 other mausoleums that are similar. They haven't been exposed yet, so they might not be as heavily guarded as Ruins Number 1. This might give us an opportunity. Perhaps the Red Angel Evil Spirit might know something, but I can't contact him now. Ignoring the question of whether chanting his honorific name will be dangerous, just this act alone will expose my intention to prevent George III from becoming the Black Emperor. To a terrifying conspirer, there are too many points that can be exploited. Queen Mystic might have some channels and clues, but I can't just rely on her. At the moment, the Church doesn't know how many of the Blood Emperor's secret ruins there are, or where they are. Attacking a key figure beside the king, such as a demigod from the royal family who is deeply involved in this matter? They must be on their guard. Furthermore, the angel of the Augustus family and that ancient secret organization would most likely be watching everything, one in the open and one in the dark. In addition, as long as the royal family's demigod ends up in an accident, George III would definitely guess that someone is trying to stop him from becoming a god. Yes, Demoness of White Katarina will be easier to deal with than the demigods of the royal family. It would attract much less attention. Theoretically speaking, George III, who has been tacitly accepted by the few major churches, no longer needs to work with the Demoness sect. Not that there is a need for that. If not for some particular reason, the two sides would have been completely tied together in this matter. The first thing he needs to do now is to cut off ties with the Demoness sect. Of course, he would most likely not betray the Demoness sect directly. On the one hand, the demonesses are also adept at ploys, so they wouldn't be unwary. On the other hand, if they anger the upper echelons of the Demoness sect, George II's Black Emperor ritual might not be that safe. This is a secret organization with a true deity, Grade 0 sealed artifacts, and angels. As long as George III is still rational, the correct method is to follow the agreement and give everything that needs to be given. Then, he will send the members of the Demoness sect away. During this process, he will use the help of angels from the mind domain, or even a king of angels to erase the key memories of the demon sect participating in the matter. If that's the case, even if Demoness of White Katarina goes missing for some time, it wouldn't alert George III. He might not even know. And from the perspective of the Demoness sect, the matter has come to an end. The various churches have also tacitly agreed to it. They no longer need to hide like they did in the past and can move about freely. This gives me and Queen Mystic a chance. Yes, Vice Admiral Ailment will likely appear again. From her appearance and the attitude of Demoness of White from back then, it can be determined that she and Katarina are related by blood. With this in mind, Klein heaved a sigh of relief. He cast his gaze out the window and silently muttered, "I hope Anderson and Danitz can find that pirate admiral as soon as possible. I hope that the City of Miracles in Grozel's travels can effectively destroy the influence of the mind domain." And all he could do now was to wait patiently. Berserk Sea. Theros Island. Danitz said to Anderson in delight, "I just learned that the southwest region of this place isn't a normal sea route. There's an island with no resources but is hidden enough." Chapter 1095. Acting as himself. "You suspect that Vice Admiral Ailment's fleet is hidden there?" Anderson asked in thought when he heard Danitz's words. Danitz replied in excitement, "It's very likely. Didn't the Black Death vanish after steering towards the west and after leaving Theros Island?" Anderson curled his lips and chuckled. "If Vice Admiral Ailment's whereabouts were so easily discovered by you, why would she need to hide? How can islands that you can find out about be considered hidden enough?" "Hey, what do you mean by that?" Danitz felt like he had been mocked. Anderson shrugged. "I don't mean anything. I'm just using my brain to analyze it. That island should exist, but it either belongs to the type that many people here know about, or it's intel that someone deliberately released. If it's the former, Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy's fleet definitely wouldn't be hiding there. If it's the latter, that would be interesting. Who would release this intel?" Danitz was still a little angry at first, but later, he began analyzing Anderson's line of thought. A trap set up by some pirates or adventurers. However, an island without any resources isn't enough to lure others into exploring it. Vice Admiral Ailment herself? To figure out who's investigating her whereabouts? Anderson smiled. "That's right. After my teachings, you've improved quite a bit. Otherwise, I suspect that even if you drink the Conspirer potion, you wouldn't be able to enhance your brain. You'll only mutate and turn your enemy stupid, bringing him down to a level at which you're familiar with, and then defeat him with experience." "I didn't say that. It was Emperor Roselle." After this period of searching, Anderson had already helped Danitz obtain one of the main ingredients of the Conspirer potion and nearly all the supplementary ingredients. He was just one step away from success. "I suspect that you have such an ability," Danitz muttered softly in response. Anderson ignored him and continued, "If Vice Admiral Ailment got someone to release the news herself, the secret island must be a trap. Perhaps there's nothing other than a mirror that monitors the ships and humans that approach the island. Or perhaps it might be an important gathering base of the Demoness sect that Gehrman Sparrow mentioned." "Then what should we do next?" Danitz subconsciously asked. Anderson chuckled when he heard that. "You can't even figure out such a simple matter? Naturally, we'll seek out the person you heard this intel from. After finding the source of his information, we can trace it back, and we'll eventually find something." "That's right." Danitz wanted to nod in agreement, but the words that reached his mouth turned into a heh. Nearing dawn, on the second floor of a casino. Bart's, with his brown hair, yawned and walked into his room. Before he could use the moonlight outside the window to light the candle, he suddenly saw a bright white flame light up in front of him, momentarily blinding him. Bart's heart tightened as he pounced to the side and rolled. After rolling twice, he suddenly stopped his actions, as though he had been petrified. This was because there was a bone-chilling coldness and a slight pain around his neck. This made him have no doubt that if he proceeded any further, blood would definitely spray onto the roof. "What do you want?" At that moment, Bart's vision had recovered. He saw a blond man with one hand in his pocket and a black short sword in the other. Beside him was a man wearing a black cloak that covered half of his face with a hood. Danitz didn't answer Bart's question as he looked at Anderson in surprise. "Why didn't you disguise yourself? If you disguise yourself, how can you let others know who to hate?" Anderson replied with a nonchalant look. Danitz exhaled. "Thankfully, I haven't been infected by this crappy habit of yours." "It's fine," Anderson said with a smile. "Any random person on the island can know who I've been hanging out with." "Dog's hit," Danitz cursed. Bart's, who had Anderson's sword at his neck, didn't dare to move. All he could do was listen quietly. He felt as though he had returned to Trier and was watching a comical scene. What are the two of them here for? The intelligence peddler was deeply puzzled. At that moment, Anderson retracted his gaze and looked down at Bart's. "Who told you about the secret island to the southwest that deviates from the main sea route?" Bart suddenly came to a realization as he looked at Danitz. "It's you." In the past few days, this information had only been sold to one person. "I was recognized so quickly?" Danitz was momentarily at a loss as to how to respond. Anderson slightly lowered the pitch-black short sword in his hand, making the stabbing pain even more obvious. "Please respect the order of what is to come and follow." Bart's immediately felt as though his life was rapidly slipping away. He hurriedly replied, "It was Vice Admiral Ailment." "When did she tell you? Why did she tell you?" Anderson asked without any surprise. "The night before the Black Death left Theros Island," Bart's replied quickly, afraid that he would die from excessive blood loss. "I didn't ask her why. Back then, I was only focused on admiring her beauty. She lives up to being the infamous ailment maiden of the 5 seas. Even after a long time, Bart's couldn't hide his admiration of her, even when he recalled her while being in extreme danger. "Is this the charm of a demoness?" Anderson muttered to himself before asking, "Do you have a way to contact her?"
"No."
Bart's quickly shook his head and said, "She told me to take note of everyone who asked about her whereabouts. I'll tell her when she returns to Theros Island. And if anyone leaves the port after obtaining the information on that secret island, they shall be left alone to leave freely."
"Is that so?"
"Very reasonable." Anderson nodded and withdrew the short pitch-black sword. "Is there a trap?" "I don't know either," Bart's replied frankly. Anderson didn't say a word as he searched for the money on Bart's person and in the room. Then, he pointed at the intelligence peddler with his short sword. "I wanted to kill you, but no one will hate me if that's the case. Live well. Curse me a few more times every day." He then turned around, walked to Danitz's side, and jumped down the window with him, disappearing into the dark, unlit night. Bart's touched his bleeding neck and stood up in fear. He ran to the window and confirmed that the two of them had disappeared. "Thankfully, I met a guy with mental problems. If not, I would be dead today." He closed the window and locked the wooden door. After carefully inspecting the room, he finally sat down and gulped down half a bottle of Lanti-Proof. In his tipsy state, Bart's collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep. Time ticked by slowly until it was 3 a.m. Suddenly, Bart's flipped over and sat up. His eyes were bright and spirited, and he didn't even feel the slightest bit drunk. He found a dagger and pried open a wooden floor in the room. He took out a thumb-sized ball of paper. After the white paper unfolded layer by layer, there was a sticky black object in the middle. After taking a quarter of the blob, Bart's walked to the mirror in the room and was about to smear it. At this moment, he saw 2 figures reflected in the mirror. One of them was wearing a white shirt and a black vest with one of his hands in his pocket, and the other carrying a short sword. The other wore a black cloak that didn't reveal his face. Just as Bart's pupils dilated, Danitz punched the back of his head, causing him to faint. And his final memory was a voice with a smiling tone. He really didn't disappoint. After dealing with Bart's, Danitz bent down to pick up the sticky substance that had fallen to the ground. He chuckled and said, "This fellow actually believed you." He believed that you didn't kill him because you wanted him to hate you. The conversation he had with Anderson was actually a rehearsed play. It was to make it reasonable for Anderson to let Bartz go without being suspected. This means that you acted sufficiently well, Anderson said with a smile. It's truly different when you're acting as yourself. Dogs hit. Danitz cursed without any qualms. He then sighed. I didn't expect him to be so patient. He waited past midnight before he took action. But we were more patient. If a hunter wants to capture his prey, he has to be patient. Sometimes, he can wait a few days, Anderson replied. To the two of them, there was actually nothing they could do. Be it a hunter and provoker, or pyromaniac and reaper, none of them were good at mediumship, much less having the ability to hypnotize others. In order to obtain information, other than interrogating and threatening others, they had to work hard on scheming. This is very reasonable, but in the future, it will be done with the words I use to school others. Danitz looked at the black sticky blob in his hand and said, It seems like it should be applied on the surface of the mirror. Before contacting Vice Admiral Ailment? That should be the case. However, what's the point even if we contact her? Are we going to ask her out on a date to join us for breakfast at Thero's Island? Anderson mocked. Danitz knew that he and Anderson were unable to influence the person in the mirror. All he instinctively wanted to do was to do something more, so as to better complete the task that Gehrman Sparrow assigned him. He frowned slightly and said, Then what should we do next? Of course it's to contact Gehrman Sparrow. Let him handle the aftermath. This fellow is very mysterious in every aspect, so he should have a way to resolve it, Anderson said with a TSK. Besides, the mission he gave us is to seek out Vice Admiral Ailment's whereabouts. And there are results already now. Danitz acknowledged and began taking out the candles and other items for the ritual. What are you doing? Anderson asked with an odd expression. Danitz set up the altar without looking back. Summoning Gehrman Sparrow's messenger. Anderson fell silent for a few seconds before saying, I'll go out for a smoke first. Chapter 1096 Cooperation. At just past 6 in the morning, the entirety of Backlund remained dark. It was very quiet, with most areas being illuminated only by the street lamps. Wearing his pajamas, Klein sat on the bed and looked at Miss Messenger, who was carrying 4 heads. He rubbed his temples and asked helplessly, Who sent the letter? Why couldn't he have a good night's rest? The 3 heads in Rionette Tinker's hands replied one by one. That particular, brainless, servant of yours, Danitz. He prayed in the middle of the night in the past, and now he's sending letters in the morning. Klein took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. Following that, he received the letter from Miss Messenger. When he opened it, his expression gradually turned solemn. This was because Danitz and Anderson's discovery of Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy's location was extremely untimely. According to Klein's deductions, it wouldn't take long for the Pirate Admiral and Demoness of White Katarina to regain their freedom. They wouldn't be hiding much, making it easier to find them. Now that they had dealt with the intelligence peddler, Bartz, and obtained the items to contact Tracy from him, the greatest possibility was that they had frightened the target and made her continue hiding. Of course, Klein could seek the help of Queen Mystic Bernadette to find a way to lock onto Vice Admiral Ailment through the mirror. However, the problem was that he suspected that the target's hiding place was an important stronghold of the Demoness sect. It might even be the headquarters where there were Grade 0 sealed artifacts. This way, even if he had confirmed the whereabouts of Tracy, he wouldn't dare to teleport over to capture her. Hence, any contact would alert the Pirate Admiral. And if he didn't take the opportunity to contact her, regardless of whether Bartz was dead or alive, the news would spread after daybreak. Similarly, Tracy would be on guard. Seriously. However, this is also because Anderson and Danitz don't know the truth. They don't know the changes in the situation of the Lone Kingdom. After some thought, he said to Miss Messenger, who was waiting by the side, Wait for me. I'll write a reply. He had originally planned to teleport over directly to decide what to do next, but after some consideration, he still chose to write a letter. Although he believed that Zeridel wouldn't waste time on an obvious bait like Danitz, he still felt that he had to be more careful. If Zeridel didn't do so, it didn't mean that the members of the secret order under him would do the same. Such a huge secret organization definitely had a few demigods at the saint level. Once he got entangled by the other party, it would be a huge problem. All right. The head carried by Rionette Tinker that had failed to speak previously rushed to answer first. Klein got out of bed, walked out of the bedroom, and came to the room outside. He took out a pen and paper and wrote fluidly, "Think of a way to make Bart's faint until dawn. Then, leave his room immediately and stay far away. There is a great danger lurking there. Monitor Bart's again when daybreak arrives, but don't alarm him." The so-called danger was a half-truth, and his main goal was to get Anderson and Danitz to leave the scene, so as to draw away any possible spying. Putting down the pen and looking through it again, he folded the letter and handed it to his messenger, Rionette Tinker, who had followed him out. At 3:10 a.m. in the Berserk Sea, Theros Island, Bart's room. Danitz had just finished clearing the altar and wiping away the traces when he saw the terrifying messenger with 4 heads return. Gehrman Sparrow actually didn't come. Danitz reached out to receive the letter in surprise. Then he took out a gold coin for the messenger. After the figure with 4 heads and dark, complicated long dress disappeared into the void, he opened the letter and quickly read through it. "There's danger." Danitz's pupils dilated as he rushed towards the door as if he had been burned in the ass. After leaving the room, he said to Anderson, who was standing in the corridor with his back against the wall with an unlit cigarette in his mouth, "Quick, let's go. It's very dangerous here." "Did Gehrman Sparrow say that?" Anderson was taken aback as he asked thoughtfully. "Yes, how do you know? Couldn't it be that I discovered something?" Danitz replied instinctively, "You, ha." Anderson chuckled and asked rather relaxed, "What else did he say? Aren't you nervous?" Gehrman Sparrow is very reliable on such matters. Danitz's focus was completely off. Anderson fell silent for a moment before saying, "His messenger is more reliable. At least, within the few minutes of his messenger's return trip, there won't be any danger here. If there really was any danger lurking here, they would silently shrink back when they saw the messenger." Danitz originally wanted to reply that it may seem so in terms of her image, but for some reason, he instinctively gave up on that sentence. He switched to saying, "Gehrman Sparrow also said to let Bart's pass out until dawn so that we can monitor him again when the sun rises without exposing ourselves." Anderson frowned. What does he want to do? There won't be any latent dangers anymore once the sun rises? Without waiting for Danitz to respond, the strongest hunter of the fog sea turned around and entered the room. He took out a small metal bottle he carried with him and pulled out the stopper. He placed it at the tip of Bart's nose and moved it back and forth. "It's done. Let's go." Anderson didn't hide his curiosity as he surveyed the area before leading Danitz out of Bart's room and walked far into the distance. Backlund, Empress Borough. Inside the Hall family's luxurious mansion. At 7:25 a.m. Audrey suddenly woke up from her dream. She dreamed of the boundless gray fog and dreamed of the world Gehrman Sparrow asking her to help hypnotize someone, making the target forget everything that had happened in the past 6 hours, as well as all the people who asked about a particular secret island. This is something that can be used as contributions needed for the manipulator potion formula and beyonder characteristic. Also, Mr. World said that he would donate £7,000 for the war efforts. Audrey got off the bed very lightly and put a teal cloak over her white nightgown. Following that, she followed Gehrman Sparrow's instructions and set up a ritual, praying for Mr. Fool's bestowment. The illusory door quickly took shape and opened, sending 3 items flying out and landing on the altar. One of them was a thin human-skinned glove, the other was the instruction manual on a piece of paper, and the other was a neat stack of cash that wasn't tied up. This is creeping hunger? Audrey scrutinized the altar and thanked Mr. Fool. Then she put on the glove and, according to the instruction manual, activated the spirit of the traveler. When the glove turned transparent, the 12 sacred angels with fiery wings suddenly appeared in front of her. This is the angel's embrace that Mr. World has requested? Its effect is to interfere with divination and prophecy powers at the scene, so as to ensure that my identity won't be exposed? Audrey's eyes darted around as she changed the lie accessory which she had already prepared into a silver mask, and she wore it on her face. Following that, she followed the coordinates given by the world Gehrman Sparrow and began the teleportation step. During this process, the strange scenery of the spirit world and all kinds of strange creatures left a deep impression on her. However, before she could carefully observe them, she arrived at her destination. She saw that the colors were saturated, and the stacked scenes rapidly faded away, becoming normal. It was still late at night outside. It feels like I've recovered my feelings and mood from when I first entered the mysterious world. Audrey analyzed her mental state and focused her attention on the target lying on the floor in the room she was in. It was an unconscious man. The door to his body of heart and mind was rather weak, meaning that he was someone who could easily be charmed, even if it didn't involve beyond her powers. Hypnotizing such a target wasn't difficult for Audrey. However, in order to digest the potion, she decided to use dreams to help with the hypnosis. The unconscious Bartz had a dream. He dreamed of a blurry female figure. In his dream, he believed that she was the most beautiful woman in the world, a perfect state that Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy could achieve. Bartz wildly chased her as he ran back and forth in the wilderness, hills, and mountains. However, he couldn't catch up to her, as though he had left behind something very important. After an unknown period of time, he woke up from exhaustion and slowly recalled what had happened last night. He was in a bad mood because of him losing money. He had fallen drunk after drinking only half a bottle of Lanty Proof. Up to now, his temples were still throbbing in pain. I even knocked the back of my head. Bartz rubbed the swollen area and lumbered back to the bed. He fell into it and continued sleeping. And for Audrey, who had completed a milder form of hypnosis with the Dreamwalker's powers, she had long followed the World Gehrman Sparrow's instructions and restored the scene completely, leaving nothing suspicious behind. This was the ability of a senior spectator. Then Sheep teleported back to Backland and sacrificed creeping hunger to Mr. Fool. The entire process didn't cause much of a stir. The Church of Evernight Beyonders in charge of protecting the Hall family were completely unaware. After dealing with all kinds of traces, Audrey pulled a bell and let the maidservants waiting outside enter. Her personal maidservant, Annie, gestured for the other maidservants to get busy as she said to Audrey, "Miss, there's a piece of news from the Bursary Foundation."
What news?
Audrey interpreted the shock, confusion, disbelief, joy, and curiosity in Annie's tone. Annie replied quickly, "That Miss Eudora who needed to have her leg amputated has completely recovered. It's as though she was never injured. This is a medical miracle." Audrey was similarly stunned. She had some guesses, but she didn't dare to confirm them. She lacked sufficient clues and evidence. Also, all the patients with serious medical conditions have fully recovered. At this point, Annie couldn't control herself. She lowered her voice and said, "I heard that there was a ghost wandering around. Half of its face had mushrooms growing all over, and the other half was covered in weeds. It ate illnesses, trauma, and grief. I don't know if it's true, but it's scary." Mushroom. Weeds. Audrey repeated the two words, momentarily at a loss. Chapter 1097 Different Conundrums. Seeing that her mistress was clearly interested in ghost tales, Annie glanced at the other maids who were preparing hot water, combs, and other items. She continued, "The doctors and nurses wished to invite the church's bishop to host a mass, but the remaining patients strongly objected to it. They look forward to meeting that ghost. They all call it the Clown Angel. They say that its terrifying appearance resembles a specially dressed clown, but in actual fact, it's an angel who can resolve pain and torment." "This title is very interesting," Audrey said with a faint smile. If it were in the past, she would definitely be very interested in this, perhaps eager to make a trip to the hospital via dream traversal to figure out what was going on with the so-called Clown Angel. However, the sudden eruption of the war made her feel rather depressed. She felt that there were too many important things that she needed to do, so she wasn't in the mood to probe further. In fact, if she hadn't experienced the air raid herself and seen those who were injured because of it, she would definitely feel like a war had never happened over the past few days and that Backland was still very peaceful. This was because, after that air raid, the airship fleet of the Lone Kingdom had been roped into the war effort. The air defenses of the coastal cities had all been raised, and Backland didn't suffer another attack again. Currently, the battle between Faysac and Lone was mainly focused in three places: the Winter County's Amantha Mountain Range, the heavy industry metropolitan area along the Mid-Seashire's east coast, and the few harbors along the Sonia Sea coast. Furthermore, they were in a deadlock with no side gaining an advantage over the other. Even if there were casualties, it didn't have any material impact on Backland. Other than the rise in prices with several editorial pieces in the newspapers, this city seemed to restore its peace in a few short days. However, Audrey didn't think so. Her father and brother have been busy with work recently, often returning late at night or convening a private gathering with a group of nobles, members of parliament, and clergymen. Through the other charity organizations in the Church of Evernight, she learned of the exact number of casualties at the front lines of Pritz Harbor and Amantha. She even saw some photos of the battlefield. She was working hard to gather funds, contacting various pharmaceutical companies and hospitals, hoping that she could organize help and treatment needed in the war effort. Who would have thought that the crazy adventurer has not only offered the excess food in his manor, but he has even donated £7,000 in cash. Audrey sighed secretly and began letting the maidservant help doll her up. South of the bridge, Rose Street. Emlyn White casually donated £10 to a charity organization's solicitor. He pressed his top hat and walked up the stairs, entering the Harvest Church. At this moment, there were no believers in the cathedral. Father Xueqi, who looked like a half-giant, sat at the front and prayed sincerely. Emlyn was in no hurry to change into his priest robes. He sat beside the priest and wanted to say something, but when he opened his mouth, he ended up scoffing. "It must be your typical Fasak appearance and figure that made those believers fearful of coming over," Emlyn said casually as he looked at the altar in front of him. Bishop Xueqi put down his hands and opened his eyes. "I can understand them." "What's the point of understanding them? If the war gets more intense and the number of soldiers who die in the battle increase a bit more, the believers might rush in here and bomb the cathedral and hang you to death." Emlyn continued to look at the sacred emblem of life. Father Xueqi shook his head slightly. "No, they won't. They sincerely believe in the Earth Mother. They won't bomb the cathedral. At most, they will banish me. If I express that I've given up on my Fasak nationality, there will always be people who will understand and accept me." Emlyn sked and said without moving his gaze, "What if Fainapotter joins in the war and attacks Desi Bay, Lone Territory? What if the Church of Earth Mother calls all clergymen to arms and become enemies with Lone? Are you going to obey the orders of the Church and abandon the believers here? Or are you going to pretend that you don't know anything? Continuing promoting how precious life is, how joyous the harvest is as you are now? Or will you directly organize those believers to make them become enemies with their own kind, using blood and sacrifices to prove their faith?" Bishop Xueqi slowly looked at the sacred emblems of life up and above the altar, not saying anything for a long time. Emlyn didn't bring up any more questions as he fell silent like the priest. The entire Harvest Church was silent. On a colonial island, Alger Wilson, who hadn't had the chance to return to Pasu Island, didn't leave the Blue Avenger due to his principles of being cautious. He only sent his sailors to take turns to gather information. "Captain, there still isn't any news about mustering us," a sailor reported to Alger of his findings of the day while reeking of alcohol. Alger waved his hand and dismissed his subordinate to leave the room. Then, he frowned slightly and muttered silently to himself, "The Church doesn't seem to care much about this war." From what Alger knew, this was likely an intense war that would cover a huge scale. As the victim of an invasion, the Church of the Lord of Storms would definitely mobilize all its strength to defeat the enemy, including the captains who were scattered across the sea by giving them corresponding missions. However, at this moment in time, Alger had yet to receive orders from Pasu Island. This didn't mean that the Church of the Lord of Storms was slacking off. The activity of the Church's forces amongst the Lone Army and the air raid drills it was involved in the various major cities, and the activities of the demigods implied that the Church of the Lord of Storms was seriously resisting the invasion of the Fasak Empire. It was just that it wasn't going all out. Could it be that it's because we're still in the early stages of the war? The Church wishes to preserve a portion of its strength for the critical moment? Alger held back the stirrings in his heart and waited for further information. At night, another group of sailors returned with news that had nothing to do with the war. "Captain, there seems to be some kind of monster hiding on this island. Many pirates say that they encountered a terrifying situation when they head out to pee after drinking too much. Some of them were violently slapped by the branches of trees, while others saw fruits growing on their bodies, ones filled with blood and flesh in them. Some of them encountered skinny ghostly figures with wheat faces." A rather sober sailor described the rumors he had heard. Tales about ghosts and monsters. Alger didn't have the intention to probe into the truth of the matter. He nodded and sternly warned, "Don't go out at night." After such paranormal tales started in Backland and Pritz Harbor, Klein never went to those hospitals again, afraid that he would directly meet Zeratl's marionettes. With the creeping hunger and the ability to travel, he expanded his range for creating terrifying tales. Sometimes, he would be in the Sonia Sea, at other times in the Fog Sea. He would go to Lenberg, sometimes to Fainapotter, and sometimes appear in places like East and West Balam, the Highlands and Valley. He didn't abide by any rules, and he relied solely on his momentary inspiration. He would visit some cities 2 or 3 times while not stepping foot into others even once. During this process, Klein felt an inexplicable strange feeling. In the terrifying darkness, invisible tentacles extended out, either searching for his whereabouts or attempting to predict his movements so as to intercept him ahead of time. They were silent and cold, and once they entangled him, the consequences were unimaginable. Klein knew that this might be the result of Zeratl's search. His best solution was to temporarily stop acting and to lay low in wait. However, it was also this subtle feeling that made him wish to digest the potion as soon as possible. Hence, he made use of the gray fog's powers. Every time he randomly chose a target location, he would go above the gray fog to divine the danger level and use paper angels to interfere. At this moment, with the huge progress in his digestion, he teleported to Xueqi, which was in the northern state of West Balam. This was where he had killed in Zangwil to avenge himself and the captain. The moment his figure appeared in the white feather square, he suddenly sensed something amiss. The residence that belonged to May Sanchez was too quiet. It was so quiet that it sent chills down his spine. May Sanchez was a native general who had previously bought arms from Dwayne Dantes. He was a beyonder of the death pathway, and he was backed by the Church of Knowledge. What happened? Klein frowned slightly as he considered whether he should enter to confirm the situation. After all, that was his collaboration partner. Furthermore, if he were to encounter an enemy that wasn't weak, it would be a very good opportunity for him to act. After doing a self-analysis of the situation, he believed that if he could use a saint-level demigod as the main lead and create a few more horror tales, then his Bizarro sorcerer potion would be digested for the most part. Of course, the prerequisite for everything is to be safe. I have to be careful and cautious. As he made his marionette, Kona's Kilgore, transform into the appearance of Dwayne Dantes, he took out a gold coin. This time, the revelation he received was that there wasn't any danger. Strange. Klein didn't let his guard down as his body turned incorporeal before becoming a shadow that disappeared into the darkness of the night. As for his marionette, Kona's Kilgore walked slowly towards May Sanchez's mansion with his face facing down. This was the ability to hide in the shadows that creeping hunger provided itself. As for the other marionette, Anuni, he was waiting about 1,000 meters away. As for the few brats that belonged to the marionette, they were spaced out nearly 1,000 meters away from each other, but they were unable to do anything. Soon, Dwayne Dantes arrived in front of the general's residence and activated his spirit body threads vision. What entered his vision were black illusory threads that were grown in a messy fashion. They seemed to come from different people, but they also had an obviously similar aura. And normal spirit body threads didn't exist at all. After a few seconds of silence, Dwayne Dantes extended his right hand and pushed open the closed door. The scene inside was completely different from what he remembered. The pillars that were covered with golden foils, the golden sculptures on the walls, and gorgeous stairs were now rolled into a bunch like a huge porcupine with golden spikes growing out of it. On the ground, there were sharp stone pillars and shattered glass everywhere. Apart from these, there were more illusory bookshelves in the hall that didn't appear real. There were pools of black shadows hidden in different spots on the bookshelf as they curled and stretched like eyes from time to time. As the door opened, the pool of liquid-like shadows suddenly came alive and produced the same sound. "It's you. My prediction was right. You're the one who can help me out of my conundrum." Chapter 1098 Contribution Accumulation. Upon hearing the words of the pools of black shadows, a figure suddenly appeared in Klein's mind. It was the elder in a white robe with inlaid brass lines. His hair was completely white and neatly combed. His pair of gray-green eyes left a deep impression on him. He claimed to be a member of the Church of Knowledge and that he was in charge of matters in West Balam and had a close relationship with May Sanchez. Back then, he had suddenly paid a visit to Dwayne Dantes, giving the excuse for his visit as him having predicted that he would be in a very troublesome situation in the future, and that someone he met during that time period would help him resolve the problem. After some thought, he slowly said, "Luca Brewster?" "Yes, it's me. You actually still remember me." In the different parts of the illusory bookshelves, the pool of liquid-like shadows rushed to answer. Their voices were no longer uniform. They were layered over each other, echoing endlessly. Even though he was separated by his marionette, Klein's ears still rang, and he felt a sense of dizziness. This isn't a normal sound. It contains a certain inclination towards losing control or experiencing mental corruption. The illusory bookshelves themselves are just for show. Just as this thought flashed through Klein's mind, He heard the black shadows curling and extending at the same time. Sorry, I was too agitated just now and couldn't control myself. Hiding in the shadows outside the mansion, Klein controlled his marionette, Kona's Kilgore, and said, "What did you encounter? How did you end up like this?" The black figure sighed and said, "The adjudicator of the Fainapotter military, Bella Costa, and the Church of Earth Mother's Archbishop Martina, jointly attacked this place, with their main target being me. I had no choice but to activate my mythical creature form and make them temporarily retreat. Seeing as you entered without noticing anything, you must have teleported here. You're also a demigod. You should know that once you reveal your mythical creature form, it won't be easy for you to return to normal. I was also affected by inclinations towards going insane, and I nearly lost control. Fortunately, I was once a mysticism magister and had mastered many strange but effective mystic arts. Hence, I sealed myself to a certain extent at the critical moment and ended up like this. Sigh, this can only last for some time. The madness is still eating at me. I've already contacted the sea, and it wouldn't be long before a helper comes. However, I don't know if I can last that long. I was just thinking that this should be that very troublesome conundrum in the prophecy, and I was wondering if the person who could help me solve this problem would appear. I'm so happy that you're here. This proves that my prediction and interpretation wasn't wrong. This has improved my mental state. He really is a demigod who's determined to see his predictions succeed. If I were to turn around and leave at this moment, would you just break down and lose control on the spot?" After lampooning silently in his heart, Klein began thinking about the key information that was revealed by Luca Brewster. The Fainapotter military and the Church of Earth Mother had begun taking action. He then got his marionette, Kona's Kilgore, to take out a gold coin and flick it before reaching out to catch it. From what he knew, the clergymen of the 7 churches were focused on maintaining order and ensuring the safety of their believers, regardless of the situation. From this angle, it was impossible for Luca Brewster to be a devil or a demon. As for the impression that Vice Admiral Iceberg and Detective Isengard Stanton gave him, it made him feel that the Church of Knowledge wasn't too bad. He felt that, other than their habitual discrimination against people with low intelligence and those who were not fond of studying, there was nothing wrong with their actions and style. This is also the reason why they're unable to develop and expand. They can only stay in a few small countries. Klein didn't look at the result from flipping the gold coin. He mumbled a few words before saying, "How can I help you?" The excited black shadows fell silent. A few seconds later they said, "I don't know either." Klein looked at them, and they looked back at him in silence. Instantly, there was a mutual silence. "Why don't I suggest turning you into my marionette?" Nearly 10 seconds later, Klein lampooned inwardly. His thoughts raced as he began to think of a way to resolve the Luca Brewster's problem of not being able to recover from his mythical creature form. To be honest, his seriousness towards helping Luca out wasn't just because of his good impression of the Church of Knowledge and Wisdom, but also because of interests that could benefit him. Firstly, there was the inkling of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom's existence in the matter of Grozel's travels. At present, he was unable to determine the true God's goal. He felt that showing some goodwill might lead to pleasant surprises. Secondly, if Rozel's return really happened, the attitude of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom was rather important. From the Red Angel Evil Spirit's tone and manner of speech, Klein could make a preliminary judgment. Compared to the 4th epoch, the 7 deities of the present era had a drastic change in attitude towards the appearance of a Black Emperor. Their reaction wasn't as intense as before, and they were more inclined to tacitly approve of it, even if the person wasn't their own candidate of choice. Under such circumstances, if Emperor Rozel were to return, the only ones who would be against it would probably be the eternal blazing sun and the god of steam and machinery. After all, back when Rozel perished, they had been involved in the matter to some extent. However, this objection wouldn't be too strong either. As long as Rozel's mental state was normal and he escaped the corruption and madness, there was a chance of being accepted. After all, the Black Emperor didn't have the problem of switching with the sun and savant pathway, so there weren't any direct conflicts of interest. As for the original grudge, it wasn't too serious at the level of a deity. Of course, this was just a guess Klein made from his knowledge of ancient history and from the angle of mysticism. According to his understanding of the situation, other than the god of craftsmanship, the other 6 deities had been enemies with each other back during Solomon's First Empire. They had left behind countless grudges, and had no choice but to rope in the Black Emperor back then to help them. In the end, they still put these matters behind them, and formed an alliance that lasted to this day. Even the deities of neighboring pathways could coexist peacefully to a certain extent. As long as Roselle could really be revived, then as someone who wasn't completely dead, the feud between him and the eternal blazing sun and the god of steam and machinery could be resolved. Of course, with his understanding of Roselle, it was only a matter of time before Roselle took revenge. As long as he wasn't crazy and wasn't forced into a corner and wasn't extreme, he could still understand the situation clearly and know what to do and what it meant to wait for an opportunity. Under such circumstances, Klein believed that the ones who were able to suppress the eternal blazing sun and the god of steam and machinery when they expressed their objections and also make them tacitly agree to it were definitely the Lord of Storms and the god of knowledge and wisdom, because they and the eternal blazing sun were on beyonder paths that could be interchanged. I'm just afraid that the corruption that stems from the cosmos isn't that easy to resolve. The revived Roselle may end up completely turning into an evil god, but such matters can only be done one step at a time. Only by understanding the situation can one grasp the crux of the matter and decide whether to press the button at the final moment. Humans can't stop because of worries with low odds. If that's the case, nothing can be done. Even drinking a mouthful of water might lead to the descent of an evil god. Similarly, what are the reactions of the various parties towards Roselle's return, and how intense would they be? This will require me to wait and make further observations before I can find the most acceptable solution for everyone. At the moment, causing damage during the ritual at the critical moment has the highest chance of success. As his thoughts raced, Klein looked at the pool of dark shadows and slowly said, "How long can you last?" Luca Brewster observed his condition and said, 7 minutes. I thought you were going to say 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. After lampooning, Klein said, "I'll get you a psychiatrist." As he spoke, he retreated a few hundred meters out of the shadows of May Sanchez's residence. Then, he set up a ritual and sacrificed creeping hunger above the gray fog. After doing all of this, he sat in the fool's chair, conjured Gammon Sparrow's figure, and made him do a simple and quick prayer. At this moment, it was almost dawn. As for Audrey, who had been busy with charity work, she had yet to sleep. Treat a demigod who has shown signs of losing control. I can accumulate more merit points as well. Audrey put down the fountain pen in her hand and put on a white cloak with golden patterns. Just like the previous mission, she set up a ritual to receive creeping hunger and war lie, which was in the form of a silver mask. Under the protection of Angel's embrace, she teleported to the May Sanchez mansion in West Balam according to the map provided by Gammon Sparrow. The difference this time was that, due to her facing a demigod, not only was she wearing a mask, she had also used lie to adjust her figure, aura, and appearance under the mask. Then, she saw Mr. World in the form of Dwayne Dantes. That demigod has broken down into pools of black liquid. Try not to communicate with his body of heart and mind directly. This will infect you with his inclination to lose control. If you can't treat him, I can lend you a beyonder characteristic. Klein specially warned Miss Justice. Audrey didn't say that she was very clear about this. She was very professional in this aspect and listened attentively. Let me give it a try first. She tugged at the cloak covering her body and took a few steps forward, casting her gaze at the illusory bookshelves and the pools of black liquid. Thankfully, he hasn't truly lost control. After examining for a few seconds, Audrey said gently. Accompanied by her calm and powerful words, an invisible wind of placate began to blow. The frequency at which the pools of black liquid curled up and stretched began to decrease as the sense of anxiety weakened. Audrey used placate a few more times. It was only when Luca Brewster's mental state was completely stabilized and he had the ability to cooperate did she get him to open up his mind and receive the treatment. And she took the opportunity to open the door to the demigod's body of heart and mind. She split her use of placate into multiple treatments during the process of purifying the corruption. She planted psychological cues, cueing Luca Brewster into believing that everything was fine, allowing him to easily converge his mythical creature form and turn back into a human. The reason for splitting up the process was because if Audrey was affected by the slightest bit of corruption and the negative effects, then she would immediately retreat and resolve her mental problems first. Finally, she completed the treatment and cues before taking a few steps back. Your Excellency, you can remove your mythical creature form. The moment she finished speaking, the illusory bookshelves in the hall vanished. The pools of black liquid gathered together like life, taking on a human form. The black colors quickly faded away, turning back into Luca Brewster's original form. He sighed and said with a smile, "Thank you very much. When I saw a Sequence 5 spectator come over, I thought that I would become the main ingredient for her switching to another pathway. This old man's words are so direct. I don't even know how to respond to his words. Klein turned his head to look at Justice Audrey. He realized that her eyes were closed tightly.
Huh.
Klein opened his mouth to respond to Luca Brewster. Don't worry. What you need the most right now is a set of clothes. Chapter 1099-1368 Lord of the Mysteries. Luca Brewster looked down at himself and hurriedly raised his right hand to grab something beside him. Then his grayish-green eyes darkened. The gold that mixed with the stairs suddenly flew out and fused in midair, forming a thin piece of armor that then covered Luca Brewster. Luca stretched his arms and explained as he took in the feedback. Stiano's golden armor art. Its defensive capabilities are equivalent to that of a Sequence 5 Guardian.
Stiano?
Klein asked casually. Luca said in a tone as though he was introducing a famous historical figure, one of the earliest founders of the Moses ascetic order. I heard that Emperor Roselle had previously modified this golden armor art. I wonder what effects it eventually produced. I can roughly imagine. Maybe this golden armor has 12 different styles. After muttering inwardly for a while, Klein changed the topic to the main topic at hand. Will Phaenopotter and the Church of Earth Mother officially join the war? When Luca introduced the Stiano's golden armor, Audrey opened her eyes and turned her head in a controlled manner. Without any perturbation in her eyes, she looked at the glimmering demigod. Luca sighed and said, regardless of what they were thinking previously, they'll officially join the war tonight. Of course, they wouldn't target Lone for the time being. There's a high chance that they will attack either Lemberg, Mason, or Seeger. It's to prevent an extended battlefront and from making too many enemies which would prevent them from being able to concentrate their strength. Furthermore, the Church of Earth Mother might not be willing to exert too much strength. After sighing, this demigod from the Church of Knowledge earnestly said to the silver-masked Audrey, "What kind of consultation fee should I pay you?" Audrey glanced at Mr. World beside her. "He has already paid." Luca Brewster immediately shifted his gaze to Dwayne Dantes. Klein thought for a moment before saying, "Let me ask a few questions. Please speak." At that moment, Luca didn't look like a demigod at all. Instead, he looked more like a professor waiting to answer his students' questions in class. Of course, if he could take off that set of golden armor and change into a three-piece suit, the resemblance would be uncanny. Without thinking, Klein directly asked, "What do you know about the corruption from underground?" In his opinion, if the Church of Knowledge, which was famous for being knowledgeable, knew about it, then he was definitely at a strong enough level to bear the effects. And if this wasn't suitable for Miss Justice's ears, then he believed that Luca would bring it up. After all, he wasn't merely a bookworm. As the discussion about the underground corruption stemmed from their experiences from exploring the sea of collective subconscious in Grozel's travels, Audrey had a certain understanding of it. At that moment, it didn't feel as though she couldn't understand anything. She was very focused on waiting for the demigod to give an answer. Luca frowned slightly and said, "I don't know much about it. It's as though just knowing about it will result in corruption in of itself. I've seen a sentence before in an ancient book. The higher the sequence, the more dangerous it is to be closer underground. So the dragon of imagination Ankwelt left an extremely deep trauma and some kind of fear down there?" Audrey instantly thought of the object sealed in the bronze door of the City of Miracles, Liveseed. She then looked at Mr. World beside her, but she didn't notice any changes in his expression. However, Klein made his marionette nod gently, so as to tell Miss Justice that the connections he made with were identical to hers. This made Audrey feel like she had returned to the past. Back then, she was still a low-sequence beyonder of the spectator pathway. There was no way she could decipher any useful information from Mr. World's expression and actions. The higher the sequence, the greater the threat of underground objects? This doesn't make sense. Realizing that Luca was unable to provide more information, Klein thought for a moment and said, "Second question, what prophecy do you have regarding this war?" With the mention of a prophecy, Luca Brewster suddenly became spirited. "It's only the beginning. It's far from reaching its peak. Also, a greater portion of the damage stems from the war and is also present beyond the war. I don't know what it is exactly though. The war has just begun." Audrey's heart sank uncontrollably. Stems from the war and is also present beyond the war? Is it the apotheosis ritual of Amon's brother? Or is it the advancement of the Black Emperor? Or perhaps, the return of Roselle? With a guess, Klein nodded and raised the third question. "Have you heard of the prophecy of the apocalypse? How do you interpret it?" Luca Brewster's expression instantly turned serious. No, this is not a prophecy. Anyone with the ability to predict the future is certain that the apocalypse will definitely come. God mentioned in his Holy Bible that the apocalypse will happen in the year 1368 in the fifth epoch. Of course, God also said that there will be a savior. The prophecy of the God of knowledge and wisdom? 1368. There's only about 10 years left. Could the goddess's act of destroying the alliance with the god of combat to control the uniqueness of the death pathway have something to do with the impending apocalypse? Without realizing it, Klein's expression turned serious. However, he didn't show his reaction on the marionette's face. It will be the apocalypse in about 10 years. As for Audrey, she ruminated over the demigod's words in a daze. To be honest, she felt that it was fake. It was used by people who pretended to be mysticism experts and were religious cheats so as to deceive the people and earn money through that. Although she could foresee a large-scale war breaking out, she had never imagined that this world was very close to ending. This was the understanding of almost all ordinary people and beyonders. Why 1368? Klein couldn't help but ask. Luca Brewster shook his head. I don't know either. That's what God's prophecy says. At the thought that he was only a sequence for, making him not have the ability to resist the apocalypse, Klein rationally ended the topic. He said to the saint of the Church of Knowledge and Wisdom, that shall be all. What he really wanted to ask were things that the other party probably didn't know either. Matters like the corruption that stemmed from the cosmos, or whether Roselle could return or not, or what his state was. Luca Brewster nodded and said, in the future, if there's anything you need help with, you can come to me. For the details, find them out through Edwina. He remembered that Dwayne Dantes' firearms transaction with May Sanchez had been facilitated by Edwina Edwards. Edwina, Vice Admiral Iceberg? Audrey was taken aback for a second before coming to a realization. She glanced at Mr. World curiously. She remembered that she had read a newspaper article before. It contained the story of Gehrman Sparrow and the 3 female pirate admirals. All right. Klein was never worried about having too many helpers. After he nodded at Justice Audrey, Luca Brewster's figure quickly turned transparent, as though he had fused with the spirit world. Then, he disappeared. Looking at the spot where he had been standing earlier, and then at the hall that no longer had any gold, Klein let out a terse remark inwardly and fell silent for 2 seconds. He then made his marionette look at Justice Audrey. I thought it would be a little more troublesome. That saint had saved himself in time and was willing to trust me, allowing me to plant a psychological cue, Audrey replied with a faint smile, trying her best to appear sincere and humble. Dwayne Dantes nodded and said, this help will be taken into account. Go back as soon as possible. It's very dangerous here. Seeing that a demigod had nearly lost control, Audrey had no doubts about the danger Mr. World warned her about. She immediately used creeping hunger and teleported back to the northern continent through the spirit world. After she sacrificed the human-skinned glove to Mr. Fool and settled the rest of the matters, Earl Hall and his eldest son, Hibbert, returned home. Just as Audrey was about to head out to meet her father and chat with him, she heard her mother, Lady Caitlin, ask in the hall, did something happen again? You came back a lot later than scheduled today. Earl Hall sighed and said, Faina Potter has invaded Lenberg. Extra. Faina Potter invades Lenberg. Leonard, who was wearing a pair of red gloves, got off the carriage. Just as he was about to enter St. Samuel Cathedral, he saw the paperboy waving a newspaper and running quickly across the streets and square. He stopped the paperboy and took out a penny and bought a newspaper. As he flipped through it, he said in a low voice, perhaps it won't be long before the South becomes a battlefield. That's right. Pallas Zorost's slightly aged voice echoed in Leonard's mind. But why am I still staying in Backlund? Leonard muttered in confusion. After advancing to Spirit Warlock, he had already become the captain of a Red Gloves team. The members had been transferred from other teams, including the familiar faces of Cindy and Bob. After the war broke out, Leonard had originally thought that his team would be transferred back to the Holy Cathedral like Soist's team, so as to participate in the battle at the Amantha Mountain Range. To his surprise, he was arranged to be used as a reserve force for the Backlund Diocese. As for this large city, due to its implementation of a nighttime curfew and other emergency policies, its security was good, and there weren't many Beyonders who came out to cause destruction. Even the devils who liked to murder didn't create chaos. It made Leonard rather free, making it more relaxed for him than during non-wartime duty. At that moment, Pallas Zorost smiled and said, I have a guess. What guess? Leonard hurriedly asked in a low voice. I'm not telling you now, Pallas replied leisurely. Leonard didn't say a word. He straightened his collar and entered St. Samuel Cathedral. He exchanged a few words with the Archbishop and prayed for 5 minutes. Then, he went underground and pushed open the door to his Red Gloves team's temporary office. Good morning, Captain. Bob, Cindy, and the other Red Gloves all stood up and bowed. Upon hearing their greetings, Leonard, who felt that he was already used to it, was once again in a daze. In the blink of an eye, it was Monday afternoon. Leonard arranged for his team members to go on separate missions, and he found a lounge to wait for the gathering to begin. 1. Reference to Saint Seiya, Knights of the Zodiac. Chapter 1101 Book above the boundless grey fog. Inside the ancient palace that resembled a god's residence. Dark red beams of light shot up from both sides of the long bronze table, materializing into blurry figures. Justice Audrey immediately stood up, lifted her skirt, and curtsied towards the seat of honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. She wasn't in a bad mood, but with everything that had happened recently, she couldn't keep her spirits up like before. After all the members bowed and took their seats, Audrey swept her gaze and habitually began observing. Almost instantly, she discovered that Ma'am Hermit's mental state and body language indicated that she was worried about something. It has something to do with Queen Mystic? Or could it be that there are other problems? Or could it be that both factors are involved in the matter? Audrey was slightly surprised, and she curiously considered the possible reasons for this. After so many tarot gatherings, she had long drawn a psychological portrait of Ma'am Hermit. She believed that she was a rather contradictory beyonder. She was experienced, knowledgeable, and calm. She was also bold and reckless in certain aspects, like a young girl who had yet to mature. Combined with the relationship between the other party and Queen Mystic, Audrey's interpretation of this analysis was that, although Ma'am Hermit had experienced a lot, she had managed to resolve many problems successfully with Queen Mystic's protection and arrangements. Deep in her heart, she was still a young girl who yearned to be loved and cared for. And it was precisely within such a concealed state that Audrey boldly guessed that, when facing someone who had been abandoned, and one who didn't commit any serious mistakes, she would unknowingly show mercy, pity them and help them. At the same time, due to her being a woman who was active at sea, with the strength of Sequence 5 who also had quite a number of mystical items, experience and knowledge, while wearing heavy glasses and having interactions with Gairman Sparrow, Audrey believed that if she casually flipped through the wanted posters and newspapers related to pirates, she would be able to confirm Ma'am Hermit's identity without a doubt. However, she deliberately didn't do this. She only had a general idea as to her identity. No, Ma'am Hermit should already be a Sequence 4 demigod, so there shouldn't be too many things for her to be worried about. It's definitely not because of the war. It's impossible for a powerful pirate to be too troubled over it. As her thoughts raced, due to her lack of knowledge, Audrey had no clues apart from guessing that it was related to Queen Mystic. And at this moment, there were two matters echoing in Catlia's mind. Why did Her Majesty send so many diary pages over? If I hadn't become a mysticologist and grasped certain secret techniques, I wouldn't have been able to memorize all of them in such a short period of time. What exactly happened? Has the Queen fallen into some sort of dilemma? That fellow, Frank, actually didn't want to hold a ritual and wanted to directly consume the potion. Thankfully, I stopped him. However, the druid ritual isn't difficult for him at all. Being aware of the behavior and physical structure of various ordinary animals and 3 kinds of extraordinary creatures. As a crazy biologist, he has already done his homework in advance by trying to crossbreed plants and animals. Next week, no, he will become a druid in the next 2 days. What he needs to do is write down all the knowledge and experience that he has built up as part of the ritual. Amidst her thoughts, Catlia shelved her concerns and turned to the end of the long bronze table. She lowered her head and respectfully said, "Honorable Mr. Fool, I have found an entire book of Roselle's diary this time." An entire book. Upon hearing Ma'am Hermit's words, all the members, including the hanged man Alger, were clearly stunned. This was something that exceeded their understanding. In the past, submissions ranged from 1 to 3 pages at a time. This time, it was an entire book. Did something happen? Even though he was the least concerned about such matters, the slowest to react, the son Derek, had noticed something unusual. They all knew that Queen Mystic Bernadette was the eldest daughter of Emperor Roselle. It was normal for her to be able to provide an entire diary. However, it was abnormal for her to give an entire book. Katlia ignored everyone's gazes and continued. These diary pages aren't connected, but they all originated from Emperor Rosel's later years.
Very good.
The fool Klein nodded slightly, indicating that the hermit could begin conjuring them. One page after another, the slightly yellow pages of the diary took shape, and soon, it was stacked into one book. After receiving it, he casually flipped through it. Without reading it, he put down the diary and looked at the hermit Katlia. You can raise your questions now. Including the contributions you previously accumulated, you can ask a total often questions. He didn't read the diary carefully, because there were too many pages this time. There were at least 30 pages to read. It would require the members of the Tarot Club to wait for too long, affecting Mr. Fool's image. Therefore, he planned to read it slowly after the gathering ended.
10.
Katlia immediately felt a headache. This was because there were only 2 questions that Queen Mystic had asked her to raise. She deliberated for a moment before saying, Honorable Mr. Fool, can we split the questions into multiple sessions?
Sure.
Klein nodded with a smile. This was convenient for what he had in mind. To answer 10 questions at once was also a very difficult task for Mr. Fool. Katlia secretly heaved a sigh of relief. There are 2 questions this time. First, why does one need to be careful of the spectator? Be careful of the spectator? Audrey wore a blank look. For a moment, she was unable to find any leads for coming up with a guess. She even examined herself. Be careful of the spectator? The Moon Emlyn, the Star Leonard, and the other members of the Tarot Club all cast their gazes at Miss Justice. The fool Klein chuckled and leisurely said, A spectator always likes to hide in the shadows to secretly control certain matters, making it difficult for people to notice and be on their guard. In particular, one needs to be especially careful towards Angel of Imagination Adam. His apotheosis ritual is to consume the potion when the trend of the times follows what he envisioned. The trend of the times that follows what he envisioned. Allow the development of the times to meet his expectations? Justice Audrey couldn't help but ask Mr. Fool. Klein nodded slightly and said, That's right. A war that sweeps the entire world is exactly what Adam wants. The hanged man Alger, the hermit Katlia, and the other members of the Tarot Club were bombarded by the information divulged by Mr. Fool, and their minds were momentarily incapable of thought. Be it the apotheosis ritual or the trend of the times, all of them involved a very, very high level. It was so high that they could only look up at it. Suddenly, they vaguely understood the reason why the psychology alchemists were deeply involved in the royal family's conspiracy. And the members who knew of the Twilight Hermit Order further understood the essence of keeping the trend of the times on track. Only an existence at Mr. Fool's level can understand these secrets and participate in the corresponding game. Alger quickly found his train of thought and sighed inwardly. He was increasingly eager to become a demigod. He believed that this war would bring him plenty of opportunities, but he didn't know if he could seize them. The members of the Tarot Club were silent. As their thoughts ran through their heads, the fool Klein let out an inexplicable sigh. This was because he had no way of stopping this war. If it was only the matter of making George Ill's Black Emperor ritual fail, he could jump through some hoops and stretch himself out to affect it slightly. However, in this war involving the trend of the times, even if he was an angel, a Sequence 1 angel, there was no way he could affect the overall situation. Forcibly trying to stop it would only squish him under the rolling wheels of history. Apart from Adam, who has spent 1,000 to 2,000 years arranging for such a plot to play out, the rest of them, even the kings of angels, can only change certain situations but not the overall trend. Only a true deity at Sequence 0 can truly participate in this game. It's no wonder the Emperor said that only by becoming a god can he protect those who he wants to protect. The only thing I can do now is to make preparations for the resistance in the Rorstad archipelago. I hope they have the opportunity of being liberated from being colonies. Klein reined in his thoughts and made his gaze maintain a smiling look. He wasn't blindly opposed to everything about war. The education he had received in his previous life, and what he had seen at sea and in East and West Biome, had made him have a supportive attitude towards overthrowing colonial rule. To put it simply, what he didn't like and abhorred was an unjust war. Sensing Mr. Fool's gaze, the hermit Katlia controlled her chaotic thoughts and said again, Secondly, where is the secret mausoleum that Emperor Rosel has yet to discover?
Secret mausoleum?
Yet to be discovered? Furs became more focused as she felt that this was material for a best-selling novel that possessed all kinds of popular elements. On the other hand, Audrey and Alger could acutely sense something from this question. The eldest daughter of Rosel probably wasn't willing to accept her father's death, and was still searching for traces left behind by him, hoping to find clues to revive the emperor. Of course, they couldn't eliminate the possibility that there were other important items in the secret mausoleum. That might be Queen Mystic's goal as well. Roselle even left behind a secret mausoleum? I wonder what's inside. The Star Leonard and Judgment Zio were more concerned about this. The fool Klein was already prepared for this. He smiled and said, perhaps in the Fog Sea, in the secret primitive island Roselle discovered, or the Abyss. Abyss. Emlyn immediately felt his eyelids twitch. In the history of the Sanguine, there were many records of second epic devils wreaking havoc. Even when he read those materials after thousands of years since it happened, he still felt himself turn impetuous and become entangled by chaos. The son Derek had a similar feeling as him, but he didn't think too much about it. When reading certain documents, his mental state would be overexerted, and his mental state would unknowingly be affected. This was common knowledge known by everyone in the City of Silver, so he had to first receive general education and listen to a teacher's recount. Abyss. Audrey, Zio, and company subconsciously repeated that term in their hearts. In their daily lives, the abyss was an abstract expression. It was synonymous with danger, pain, decadence, and corruption. They never expected that it really existed somewhere in the Fog Sea. Chapter 1101 Special Reward. Katlia also didn't return to her senses for a few seconds. She never expected Emperor Roselle's secret mausoleum to involve the abyss. However, after some careful thought, she realized that it wasn't surprising that a conflict at that level would involve something like that. For a moment, she hoped that the queen wouldn't pursue this matter, but in the end, she suppressed this thought to the bottom of her heart. She felt that if it were her, then she would also make the same choice. All sorts of thoughts flashed through her mind as she bowed towards the end of the long mottled table. Thank you for your answer. I have no further questions today. The fool nodded slightly and surveyed the area. You may begin. Just as he finished speaking, Furs, who had been mustering her courage all this while, said as she closed her eyes as though she had resolved herself to charge towards death, Mr. World, I have a commission for you. Seeing the World Gairman Sparrow look over, she hurriedly explained, you don't have to do much. You'll just leave me at an unfamiliar place every once in a while, and you can pick me up after a few days. If you're really busy, you can present traveling to me several times at a particular point in time for me to record. Upon hearing Miss Magician's words, the first thought that came to Klein's mind was, man versus wild? I have too many suitable places, such as the battlefield of the gods on the easternmost front of the Sonia Sea, Calderon City in the spirit world, the City of Miracles live seed in Groselle's travels. They're 10 times, 100 times, or even 1,000 times more dangerous than the wilderness. I'm just afraid that Miss Magician won't be able to handle the danger. Klein didn't let the World Gairman Sparrow immediately answer. He controlled the fake person and cast its gaze on Miss Magician with a pressuring look. Furs silently took a deep breath, calmed her emotions, and added in more detail. This is the thing. I'm a Sequence 6 scribe of the apprentice pathway now. In order to digest the potion, aside from recording all kinds of Beyonder powers, I still need to record down the local customs and traditions of different places. I hope that I can become a traveler as soon as possible. Only then can I avoid most of the dangers during the war. Mr. World, I've only recorded traveling once, so I won't be able to return if I go somewhere else. I can only ask for your help. I wonder if you're interested, and what kind of payment you'd wish to receive. So that's how it is. Justice Audrey finally came to a realization. Furthermore, she felt that Furs's method was really great. Especially since she's a best-selling novel author, her act of recording scenery and customs and publishing it as a book should be able to greatly aid in her potion digestion rate. Audrey nodded silently as she felt sincerely happy for her friend. However, as a senior spectator, how could she not sense Furs's horror and fear towards Mr. World? She was looking forward to knowing what would happen when the two of them formally interacted. Audrey, this state of mind isn't good. However, this is the attitude of a spectator. Furs definitely wouldn't expect that the so-called crazy adventurer she fears is only a mask. Beneath it is a gentle and kind heart. I also have to work hard to digest the Dreamwalker potion. I should visit the dreams surrounding me every night. Audrey didn't show any changes in her expression or gaze as she maintained the attitude of a spectator. After the hanged man Alger heard the magician's words, he sighed. This was because even this apprentice was beginning to break through to Sequence 5, while he was still stuck at that level. The World and the Hermit are already at Sequence 4, Justice, the sun, the moon, and the star are also all at sequence 5. Apart from the magician, the newly joined judgment is lower than my sequence. As his thoughts churned, Alger felt that stifled, a heavy feeling that was difficult to resolve. He wished he could immediately find an opportunity to make contributions and become a demigod, a cataclysmic interrer. He yearned to have a high position and be in a position of power. He wanted others to acknowledge and respect him and be submissive to him. He didn't wish to fall behind in the tarot club.
Is that so?
At the same time that Klein understood what Miss Magician was thinking, he suddenly recalled something. It was the identity that the other party had mentioned in front of Mr. Fool during a particular full moon. An ex-surgeon who was now a novelist. Will spreading the terrifying legends that I create into text form help me digest the bizarro sorcerer potion further? The more shocking, harrowing, terrifying, and incomprehensible the description in the novel is, the better the effects. Klein suddenly had inspiration and controlled the World Gehrman Sparrow to say, "This commission is very simple, but the payment I need is very special." Upon hearing that Mr. World was inclined to agree, Furs asked in both joy and anxiousness, "What's the payment?" The World Gehrman Sparrow pondered for a moment and said, "Collect information about the ghost stories that have happened recently in the various major hospitals in Backland, and write them into a small publication or have them published in the newspapers. The requirement for the novel is that it's even more terrifying and bizarre. It's best if it can be a best-selling novel." The reason why he only mentioned the matters of the major hospitals in Backland was because Miss Magician was a local author who was part of medical circles. Being able to come to know of the urban myths and use that as material for a novel was very reasonable, and it wouldn't incur suspicion. However, if she had even learned of the urban myths in the Rorstad Archipelago, Fog Sea, and East and West Balam, then Zeradal's marionette would definitely visit her. The ghost tales of the various hospitals in Backland. After hearing the World Gehrman Sparrow's words, Audrey was stunned for nearly 3 seconds. She had originally thought that those rumors were caused by the church's beyonders secretly treating the injured victims. Mushroom and weeds were the negative effects of the mystical items, but she never expected it to be something else. Audrey had also guessed if it was done by Dwayne Dantes. After all, this gentleman had heard from her about the victims of the air raid. Furthermore, he was a very kind gentleman. However, due to the lack of clues and evidence, she could only believe that it was more likely to be related to the church. At this moment, she was almost certain that the clown angel was Mr. World Gehrman Sparrow. Even if it wasn't, they definitely had a deep connection. A Mr. World who wears a mushroom and weed mask is the same as the Gehrman Sparrow who wears a crazy adventurer mask. Why does he act like that when he's doing something good? Is it because he needs the feeling or corresponding feedback from creating fear? Audrey thought to herself with some guesses. As for the star Leonard and the hanged man Alger, one immediately thought of the strange urban myths that the Nighthawks who belonged to St. Samuel Cathedral were discussing recently, while the other fell deep into thought about the horror stories his subordinates had heard or encountered. I've never really heard of such payment before. It's not like I'm writing a biography. Although there has been a recent war, the sales of newspapers and novels seem to have increased. My previous editor has been urging me to write a new book. Yes, I must keep my identity a secret. I have to convince my editor to change my pen name. The excuse is that novels of different styles should use different pen names. Furs didn't think too much about it. After a slight period of deliberation, she agreed. All right, no problem. The World Gehrman Sparrow chuckled and hoarsely said, "If you do well, I'll give you the opportunity to record the beyonder powers of a demigod." No problem. Furs swept away her usual languidness and firmly replied. To her, recording a demigod's powers not only increased her ability to protect herself, but it could also effectively help her digest the potion. This also made Audrey, Zio, Leonard and the other members sigh in their hearts. Scribes were truly enviable. Once a demigod-level expert became a backer, a scribe wielded extremely powerful strength. They wouldn't be weaker than a sequence 5, or may even be stronger than one at times. After coming to an agreement, the scene fell silent for a moment. This was because the other members of the Tarot Club currently didn't have any requirements. Leonard had become a spirit warlock recently, and he had yet to conclude the acting principles. There was still the possibility of him advancing from within the Church of Evernight. As for mystical items, he had already bought the Word of the Sea. If there were any special circumstances, he could request to use sealed artifacts of the Church. Emlyn was reading the Sanguine's research information regarding the moon domain every day, hoping to make a Scarlet Scholar more practical. As for the sequence 4 Shaman King's potion formula and Beyonder ingredients, he didn't need them for an extensive period of time, nor could he afford them. Derek had recently mastered the powers of Priest of Light, and he was still very far from advancing. As for the unshadowed main ingredient, he had already obtained it. Similarly, Audrey and Zio had also recently advanced. One of them was working hard to help Mr. World, accumulating contribution points, while the other was burdened with a huge debt and was eager to repay it. Alger was in the Church of the Lord of Storms, so he had to keep a secret. He was currently in an awkward position which required him to find a chance to advance. Furthermore, he had obtained the cataclysmic Interrer's potion formula from the world. Katlia had just become a demigod. She was currently deep in research on all kinds of secrets and all sorts of mysticism knowledge. She was pleasantly surprised that, despite having recently advanced, just recalling the knowledge and secrets she knew from the past had allowed her to directly digest quite a bit of the potion. Amongst them, the various things she had heard from the Tarot Club had contributed greatly. The transaction segment quickly ended as the members began their free exchange. Emlyn surveyed the area and his gaze landed on Leonard's face. If you're an official Beyonder, how will you deal with a clergyman of an opposing faction in your area of jurisdiction? He hasn't done anything wrong, nor does he plan on doing anything wrong. Although Fainapotter had yet to start a war with Lone, they had invaded Lone's ally, Lenberg. This made the believers and citizens living around the Harvest Church look at Bishop Utravsky in an increasingly odd manner. Leonard thought carefully and said, "Protective custody." Chapter 1102 Engaging Tigers to Hunt Wolves. Protective custody. That's quite a witty answer. As expected of a newly promoted Red Gloves team captain. When the fool Klein heard the star Leonard's answer, he couldn't help but laugh inwardly. He knew very well who Emlyn was referring to, and he knew quite a bit about Bishop Utravsky, who wished to be called a priest. He didn't really believe Emlyn White's claim that he hasn't done anything wrong, nor does he plan on doing anything wrong. This was because, to a deity's blessed or a zealot, their understanding of something wrong might be different from a normal person's. Of course, Klein never suspected Father Utravsky's claim that life was precious and his piousness an acknowledgement of a joyous harvest. But the problem was that the Church of Earth Mother also preached that lives were like plants, which would ultimately wither and die, returning to the embrace of the Earth Mother. They would then grow again when the next year came. A qualified bishop of the Church of Earth Mother wouldn't treat death in the same manner as the most ordinary of people. Regardless, Father Utravsky has to be controlled. This is both a form of protection for the Earth Mother's believers, as well as the citizens around him. It's also a form of protection for this half-giant bishop, in case some irredeemable situation occurs. While Klein was thinking to himself, Leonard, who had no lack of understanding of the Harvest Church, also understood the meat of Emlyn's question. He planned on leading his team members to confirm the situation in the next 2 days, taking the Earth Mother's blessed into protective custody with the help of the official organizations that were in charge of the area south of the bridge. And when Emlyn heard the answer, he slowly nodded without saying a word. Seeing that he was silent, Leonard turned to ask a question he wanted to get some feedback on. Are there any major matters lurking beneath Backlund recently? What he really wanted to ask was why his Red Gloves team had been left behind in the capital of capitals as a part of the reserve forces. As soon as he finished speaking, the other members of the Tarot Club, including the son Derek, who wasn't too concerned about matters of the outside world, all cast their gazes at the World Gehrman Sparrow. From what they knew, whenever something happened in Backlund, Mr. World would more or less give a warning. What major matters has been lurking beneath Backlund recently? There's plenty. The Black Emperor ritual of George III, my secret alliance with Queen Mystic. The 3 churches may seem to be tacitly in approval but all have different attitudes. As Klein's thoughts raced, he suddenly understood what Leonard wanted to ask. After all, they would occasionally communicate privately. That's right. Why was Leonard left in Backlund? Because of me. The church doesn't want to put Leonard in a dangerous situation? Am I thinking too highly of myself? Klein secretly shook his head and rejected the thought that first came to him. He quickly changed his train of thought and analyzed the problem on matters that Leonard could be of service. Leonard is only a sequence 5, so what use can he play in Backlund that has deep undercurrents? Even if he's of use, they wouldn't use him. Instead, they would make use of me, who's related to him, or Palez Zorost. This can rule me out. I'm still a qualified blessed at the moment. If I really needed to do anything, then a simple instruction would suffice. The clearing of the Amon avatars in Backland last time made the goddess or the upper echelons of the church guess that Palaz Zoroast is hiding in the vicinity of Baklund Street, and they ended up suspecting Leonard? There's a possibility. And it's not a low one either. Back then I was concerned to some extent. I only believed that, in the case of Amon becoming a god, the church and Palaz Zoroast were on the same page, that they could form some sort of tacit understanding. In fact, I believe that grandpa had such considerations when he first chose Leonard as a target for parasitizing. But why is Palaz Zoroast being kept in Backland? To fish for Amon? Even among the kings of angels, Amon ranks among the top. It's almost impossible for the goddess to engage in a divine descent. With the church's angels, grade 0 sealed artifacts, and Palaz Zoroast, it shouldn't be difficult to expel Amon, but it's almost impossible to kill him, unless he doesn't come with his actual body. But in that case, it's not worth making such arrangements. Klein's thoughts quickly developed, and soon he had a new idea. Fishing for Amon isn't done so as to deal with him. Instead, it's to hold back Zeratul, who's currently in Backland. Similar pathways could be interchanged at high levels. Even if one became a true god at Sequence 0, they'd still have a strong desire for the uniqueness and Sequence 1 beyonder characteristics of neighboring pathways. On this point, the Evernight goddess's plan was excellent evidence. The goddess wants to make Backland into a potpourri mess before wiping them all out? Klein made the World Gehrman Sparrow hesitate for a few seconds before saying, the leader of the Secret Order, a Sequence 1 angel, and an old friend of Emperor Roselle Zeratul, is currently hiding in Backland. Seeing that the members of the Tarot Club were clearly a little confused and perplexed, the world added in a hoarse voice, the law of beyonder characteristics conservation we often refers to the conservation of beyonder characteristics of neighboring pathways. In other words, similar pathways also obey the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics. Leonard immediately fell into deep thought. After a few seconds, he deliberated and asked, the Marauder and the Seer pathways are neighboring pathways? Yes, the Apprentice pathway is also a neighboring pathway, the world answered frankly. Upon hearing their conversation, Furs first connected the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics to the attraction between beyonder characteristics taught to her by her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham. She connected it to the Saint of Secrets who had been attracted. Then, she began to consider a question. If it really is as Mr. World said, that beyonder characteristics of neighboring pathways attract one another, then would it have attracted the attention of Zeratul back then? After all, he is in Backland. All of a sudden, Furs thought of the raven that was staring at Botis's back. Furs hurriedly raised her hand, indicating that she had something to say. Seeing all the members looking over, she hurriedly said, my teacher is a member of the Abraham family. He wields a rather important sealed artifact. As the first part of the sentence was known by the other members other than the star, Furs had no intention of hiding anything. As for the second half of the sentence, she had made some modifications. It was very important to change the phrase to rather important. Seeing that no one was raising any questions, Furs continued, this causes him to occasionally encounter Hybe sequence beyonders of the Apprentice pathway. Previously, when he came to Backland, the Aurora Order Saint of Secrets, Botis, had appeared nearby. As for me, I noticed that a raven was looking in the direction where Botis was heading. A raven. The details of the foggy town surfaced in Klein's mind. At the top of the pitch-black cathedral, there were ravens flying around, as if they were holding a memorial or in grief. As for Zeratul's avatar, it was hidden inside the cathedral. Zeratul is used to using ravens as marionettes? Is this a mark left behind during his phase as a bizarro sorcerer? While in thought, Klein made the world speak. That might very well be Zeratul. I actually met a Sequence 1 angel. Furs felt a sense of fear and horror. She then recalled how she and Zio had discussed Adam and thus ended up possibly targeted. For some reason, she had the illusion that she had become the protagonist of a novel. Despite being only a Sequence 7 or 6, she had established connections with the Kings of Angels and Sequence 1 angels. With this in mind, Furs hurriedly turned her head to Miss Justice and said, can you hypnotize me later into forgetting certain matters? I'm afraid that I might accidentally recall something and attract attention. No problem. As Audrey answered, she glanced at Zio and nodded at her. As for the star Leonard, he had some ideas as well. He planned on discussing it with Old Man when he returned to hear his opinion. Klein didn't continue talking about the major matters that lurked beneath Backland. This was because they were just too high-end for the other members of the Tarot Club. Not only were they unable to participate in it directly, but even having a complete understanding of them could bring about a disaster upon themselves. In this aspect, Klein's idea was that he could get the help of the members of the Tarot Club in certain segments, but it was like commissioning a bounty hunter to do something, without getting them too involved in the matter and figuring out the reason for the commission. It was a form of protection for them. At this moment, Alger looked around and said, "According to my observations, the Church of Storms isn't too enthusiastic about this war."
They aren't too enthusiastic?
This doesn't match the image of the Church of the Lord of Storms. Although their teachings don't advocate combat and don't promote war, they definitely emphasize the need to treat their enemies like a storm and vent whatever anger they have on the spot.
When Klein heard this, he felt a little surprised.
He then combined his understanding of the deities and began his preliminary analysis. According to my previous speculations, Storm, Sun, Reader, Spectator, and Shepherd can switch paths at high levels. There should be an immense conflict between them. As for the Lord of Storms, he is highly likely the wind angel of yesteryear. He had eaten Adam's father, the ancient sun god, the City of Silver creator. Even if he had tacitly allowed George III to become Black Emperor, it's impossible for him to sit back and watch Adam make use of the flood of the times to ascend to divinity. Therefore, the Church of the Lord of Storms is unwilling to have the war increase in scope and allow it to turn into a world war.
Hence, he is trying hard to control his impulse?
It must be really hard on them. This can explain why Lone and Intis would maintain their strange silence when Feynapotter invaded Lenberg, Mason, and Seeger. The Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun and the Church of the Lord of Storms are probably in a difficult position. They're unable to make up their minds. On the one hand, at the level of the deities, it isn't that there is no possibility of abandoning their alliance to deal with the Church of Knowledge. On the other hand, the battle strategies at the national level also prompts them to protect those countries. Forcefully breaking the perceptions built up by the citizens of a country would be an act that causes the anchors to become unstable. Also, once they participate in the battle, they would help Adam fulfill the conditions of his advancement to Sequence 0. Klein deliberately made the world silent for a moment before replying to the Hanged Man's intelligence. At present, this is inevitable. Chapter 1103 Hin/B. Klein didn't actually remember if he had told the Hanged Man and the others that the Sailor, Spectator, Sun, Reader and Secret Suppliant pathways were interchangeable, unless he used dream divination to recall it. However, since the Hanged Man had expressed his doubts towards the Church of the Lord of Storms, it meant that he hadn't thought about the interchangeability of both paths. Regardless of whether he knew it or not, or if he had yet to connect the two matters together, Klein believed that there was a need for him to explain things clearly. This allowed the members of the Tarot Club to grasp the true stances of the various major factions, thus letting them avoid many dangers. After the Hanged Man, Alger, and the others cast their gazes at him, he controlled the world Gehrman Sparrow and made him say in a low, uncertain tone, "The Storm, Sun, Spectator, Reader, and Secret Suppliant pathways are neighboring pathways. Likewise for Evernight, God of Combat, and Death. And neighboring pathways often become enemies. Of course, that's not absolute. At least the 7 deities have established an alliance." Upon hearing the world's reply, Alger first recalled Adam pushing for the flood of the times to become a god. Following that, thoughts flashed through his mind as he gained a certain level of understanding of the Church of the Lord of Storms' current attitude. This made him feel a rather special sense of superiority and joy. It was as if he had seen the essence of the matter, exceeding the level of most Beyonders in the Church of the Lord of Storms. Similarly, Audrey had a brand new understanding of Intis's strange silence in this war. She was even more worried about the situation in Lenberg, Mason, and Seeger. In addition, she also knew that she could switch to Unshadowed, Cataclysmic Interrer, and to the corresponding Sequence 4 demigod of the Church of Knowledge and Wisdom she had recently met. As for the corresponding Sequence 4 of the Secret Suppliant pathway, it wasn't within her considerations at all. Of course, compared to other pathways, she still preferred Manipulator. She liked the Spectator pathway from the bottom of her heart. However, she also felt deep fear towards the upper echelons of the Spectator pathway. Vin Rambus had left a rather bad impression on her. Adam's "any mention of it will be known" had left her with a trauma. She had no choice but to undergo self-evaluations and treat the corresponding problems from time to time. The hermit Catlia had always been deeply knowledgeable about such matters. Apart from the information mentioned by the world Gehrman Sparrow, She also knew that the mystery prior and savant pathways were neighboring pathways that could be interchanged at high sequences. It was likewise for the arbiter and lawyer pathways, the prisoner and criminal pathways, the hunter and assassin pathway, and the planter and apothecary pathway. As the other members of the Tarot Club dispersed their thoughts, Alger said to the World Gairman Sparrow, "Thank you for your answer." He didn't say exactly what insights he had gleaned from the answer. In fact, for an instant, Alger wanted to leave the Church of the Lord of Storms and switch to another pathway. This was better than waiting for a very slim chance in the church. However, he ultimately gave up on this idea. After all, his goal for a long time was to become a cardinal of the Church of the Lord of Storms. At present, he was beginning to yearn to be ranked first amongst the cardinal ranks, becoming an angel in charge of the mandated punishers or ascetics. As for the position of pontiff, Alger didn't yearn for it. This was because it was too close to the Lord of Storms, and he had many secrets he kept close to his chest. If he were to be chosen as pontiff, Alger suspected that he would be smote to ashes by a lightning storm that descended from the sky the moment he put on the papal tiara. Seeing that the exchange between the world and the hanged man had ended, Emlyn asked with curiosity, "Which pathway can the apothecary pathway be interchanged with?" Being from the sanguine race made them have no thoughts of switching to other pathways, as it would often mean that they had lost their identity. Therefore, Emlyn wasn't too concerned about such matters. "The planter pathway of the Church of Earth Mother," Catlia answered casually. "The planter pathway, possessed by the Church of Earth Mother." Emlyn frowned as he vaguely grasped something. At this moment, Zio also asked, "Which pathway neighbors the arbiter pathway?" "Lawyer," Catlia answered simply. "Lawyer of the Black Emperor pathway." In other words, if I could become a Sequence 5, one would be able to switch to Sequence 4, the Black Emperor pathway. And Furs had previously told me that Mr. Fool has the card of blasphemy. It contains all the secrets of the Black Emperor pathway. Zio suddenly realized that there was a glimmer of light for her future. It had to be known that the arbiter pathway was firmly controlled by the two royal families. Even the corresponding military only had the potion formula for the low and mid sequences. If they wanted to advance beyond Sequence 5, they had to receive a bestowment from the royal family. Just like how every general had to be conferred by the king or queen. Furthermore, what they obtained in the end was the concocted potion and the ritual. To Zio, this meant that it was almost impossible for her to get the Sequence 4 potion formula for the arbiter pathway. Of course, no matter how tightly guarded the potion formulas was, there were bound to be loopholes. The military's demigods knew of the ritual, and from time to time, they would cooperate with the royal family to hunt powerful supernatural beings. They could roughly narrow down the candidates for the main ingredient to a small area, but this also meant that they could only confirm the formula through repeated experiments. At the same time, the military demigods were also unable to grasp the supplementary ingredients. If they wanted to rely only on the main ingredients to advance, they needed to seek out the benediction of fate. And now, Zio had seen another possibility. At this moment, Audrey had already summarized the neighboring pathways that Mr. World and Ma'am Hermit had mentioned before thoughtfully asking. Among prisoner, criminal, hunter, assassin, savant, mystery prior, and monster, which ones are neighboring similar pathways? The World Gairman Sparrow glanced at the hermit and replied hoarsely, "Prisoner and criminal, hunter and assassin, and savant and mystery prior are similar pathways that can be interchanged at high sequences." This was knowledge that could be confirmed by Klein. Among them, the interchangeability between prisoner and criminal was something mentioned by the Red Angel Evil Spirit, to which Miss Sharon tacitly accepted. The interchangeability between savant and mystery prior had been personally demonstrated by Emperor Roselle. As for hunter and assassin, it was information that he had accumulated over time which could finally be confirmed. What about monster? There's only this one left. Furs, who was listening, couldn't help but ask. Seeing the world remain silent, Catlia thought for a moment before saying, "It's difficult to be categorized as a neighbor of any other beyond a pathway. Just like fate, it can only objectively exist alone. I can be sure of that. I can only say that the most fundamental order in our world's supernatural powers might be chaos and disharmony." The reason why Catlia was certain that the monster pathway didn't have the means to be interchanged with other pathways was because her advancement ritual required her to analyze the snake of fate's blood. "I see." Audrey was slightly uncomfortable with this disharmonious situation, but she quickly adjusted her state of mind. After the exchange was almost complete, all the members of the Tarot Club looked at the son Derek. The youth said without any hesitation, "We've already set off. We're currently less than a day away from Afternoon Town. When we arrive, we'll be resting for another day or two before we begin exploring the giant king's court. The sun's words made Alger, Catlia, and company suddenly feel like myths were entering reality. Compared to places like the ruins of the battlefield of the gods, the giant king's court was a symbolic entity that appeared in various legends and in different secret documents. What secret was it hiding? What was buried in it? The answer was about to be revealed. Even though they had followed the world Gehrman Sparrow into the City of Miracles Liveseed, which was on par with the giant king's court, the Star Leonard and Justice Audrey were also secretly excited and looking forward to hearing more. After all, the city that the Dragon King had imagined into existence had lost too much in the process of being transferred to Grozel's travels. There were no traces of anything of value. Apart from the building itself, there was only the hall that expressed the extraordinariness of the ancient myths. Furthermore, what was even more important was that Derek had mentioned that the kings of angels had come to a secret plot in the giant king's court. As for the fool Klein, he was thinking of something else. Should I get little son to pray to the fool before the exploration? Then, I'll use the Crimson Star and the Sea God Scepter to extend my vision to a certain distance so that I can watch a live broadcast. Yes. In that case, if there are any accidents, I can still provide some help. The only problem is that this method of relying on the prayer points of light for observation cannot last too long. This has nothing to do with my own spirituality. It's just that this connection will fade away with time and last 45 minutes at most. Let little son pray every once in a while? That's under the premise that it doesn't affect his battle or attract the attention of the people around him. In that case, my spirituality can probably last for 2 hours. It's not on the same level as my sequence 5. Heh. It's also because of my recent rapid digestion of the potion. After pondering for a moment, Klein didn't speak. He controlled the world Gehrman Sparrow to hint to the sun. Before exploring the giant king's court, you can pray to Mr. Fool and pray for good luck. In the process you can also pray many times. Mr. World really is a nice guy. After Derek sincerely thanked him, he hurriedly turned his body towards the end of the long mottled table. Then, he saw Mr. Fool, who was enveloped by the grayish-white fog, nod slightly. Chapter 1104 Contradiction/B. The world above the grey fog had been restored to its state of silence, as though the gathering that had just ended was an illusion. Klein bent his finger and lightly knocked on the edge of the long mottled table. He made the pages of the Roselle diary which Catlia had just given appear once again. Amidst an indescribable stillness, Klein cast his gaze towards the first paragraph of the first page with a solemn expression. September 27th, I saw Miss Ithaca once again. I had a nerve-wracking and thrilling but sufficiently wonderful experience with her. As expected, I prefer women of this age. I'm not just reminiscing about my youth, but rather that I haven't changed after so many years. Heh, I'm really dedicated. I read your diary with such seriousness, and you're giving me this? The corners of Klein's mouth twitched as he lampooned at the emperor, who he had only seen a portrait of. He immediately gathered his thoughts and shifted his gaze. In a lounge at the basement of St. Samuel Cathedral. After Leonard Mitchell opened his eyes, he deliberated for a moment and said in a low voice, "Old man, the secret order Zeratul seems to be in Backland." In his mind the slightly aged voice quickly sounded. Indeed, upon hearing this, Leonard immediately asked, "Old man, are you familiar with that Zeratul? Didn't you say that the Zoroast family and the Zeratul family are both important nobles of the Solomon Empire?" From his point of view, as ex-colleagues and former comrades in arms, how could old man not be familiar with Zeratul? Palaz Zoroast scoffed. I'm familiar with the Zeratul who died in the War of the Four Emperors. The one alive who's now should be his descendant. I might or might not have seen him before. Sigh, the Zeratul back then had already obtained clues regarding the second sequence 1 beyonder characteristic from the true creator. He was waiting for the War of the Four Emperors to end before searching for it. If he succeeded, he would be considered a king of angels. Unfortunately, in the War of the Four Emperors, he directly encountered the existence from the Antigonus family who could be known as the Half-Fool, and Bethel Abraham was also involved. Heap could appear anywhere, anytime. If Heap hadn't been quickly banished and sealed by Evernight and Storm, I might not have survived to the end of the War of the Four Emperors either. The Half-Fool. Leonard's eyelids twitched when he heard this title as he thought of the entity above the grey fog for some baffling reason. He then forced himself to control himself and directed his thoughts to something else. Even from the description of a bystander, Mr. Door was clearly one of the top existences among the kings of angels. It required 2 true deities to join forces to banish and seal him. There's a high chance that he was especially good at escaping, making it very difficult to kill. And back then, the battle situation was tense, so it was imperative to eliminate an enemy that posed a threat as soon as possible. Haha, old man is reminiscing about the past, so he's feeling a little uneasy. He actually said so much in one breath. Amidst his thoughts, Leonard suddenly said, I was left in Backland because they wished to use you to attract him on here? The wistful feelings in Palaz Zorost's tone vanished as he clicked his tongue. Who made this guess? I don't think it's you. However, it's not bad that you know how to use your own resources to probe for the truth. This is something I've been very familiar with ever since I joined the Nighthawks. Leonard replied inwardly but didn't say a word. Palaz Zorost continued, I guess that too. To be honest, your ex-colleague's relationship with Evernight really confuses me. If it wasn't for how familiar the concealment forces that appeared that day was, I wouldn't have dared to make such a guess. Haha, with Zeratul and I in Backland, Amon will arrive soon too. It truly is a perfect triangle of balance. What do you mean? The concealment forces used to deal with Amon came from the Evernight domain, not Mr. Fool? Does this point that there is a certain level of cooperation between Mr. Fool and the goddess? Or is it that the faith of those higher up in the church actually to Mr. Fool? Leonard suddenly felt a strong sense of confusion and puzzlement regarding his position in the grand scheme of things. Seeing that Palaz was also quite confused, he converged his thoughts and didn't ask any questions regarding this. He frowned and said, 2 sequence 1 angels and a king of angels. Will this bring about a devastating disaster to Backland? He remembered that Amon was a terrifying existence that could kill countless people silently, and could even live happily as his victim. Using this as a reference, Zeratul, who was of a neighboring pathway, definitely possessed similarly terrifying powers. If he and Amon were to clash, half of Backland or the entirety of Backland could become the capital of death or the capital of bizarreness. Palaz Zorost laughed and said, Balance also means that everyone will be very restrained. Besides, it's very likely that Amon won't let his true body enter Backland. At most, he will send a large number of avatars over. After all, the impossibility of a divine descent by Eve might doesn't mean that storm or steam can't. What do you mean? Leonard acutely grasped the key point in old man's words. Palaz Zorost's tone suddenly became more relaxed. Regardless of whether it's because of the war or for other reasons, Eve might is likely unable to interfere with the matters on the ground at the moment. Otherwise, why would she need to lure Amon over to form a balance? She directly set up a trap, and who knows, she might be able to capture Zeratul or scare the cowardly seer away. Did something happen to the goddess? Leonard suddenly turned nervous. The slightly aged voice replied, It might not be a bad thing, and it might be a good thing. Without waiting for Leonard to ask further, Palaz Zorost sighed again. Amon was attracted to Backland by me. What about Zeratul? What about me? I think Zeratul is also here because of you, and you're in Backland because of me, Leonard pondered as he replied. Heh, why do you think you're in Backland? Palaz immediately scoffed. Leonard immediately replied, This is the arrangement of the church. It can't be the effect of the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics, right? That's not necessarily true. Palaz's tone turned a little stem. Most of the time, the law of beyonder characteristic convergence will not directly show in places where you can sense it. Most of the time it will influence fate. Just like when you board a train, you'll suddenly feel that the scenery along the way is beautiful and will get off the train in advance, resulting in you entering the small city. This might be because there are beyonders or mystical items of neighboring pathways around you. In other words, there are other things in Backland that attracts you and Zeratul here, and through you, my fate is affected, causing me to be arranged by the church to stay in Backland most of the time? Leonard asked in enlightenment, hoping to gain confirmation. Palaz Zorost slowly sighed and said, That possibility can't be ruled out. Above the grey fog, Klein soon flipped to a diary page of value. November 21st. As I had made too many preparations in the early stages, I obtained that chaotic and terrifying Grade 0 sealed artifact even faster than I imagined. And then, after a difficult battle, and with some help, I finally restored it to a pure Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristic. In a few more days, the ritual will be completed. I should be able to advance to Sequence 1 Knowledge Emperor of the Mystery Prior Pathway. November 26th. sunny and breezy. The ritual was very successful. I digested it thoroughly, and my anchors were even more stable. There weren't many difficulties during the entire process. I'm already a Sequence 1 angel, a knowledge emperor. Bernadette no longer has to worry about the influence of the hidden sage. She can abide by the words "do as you wish, but do no harm," and continue on this path. At the same time, the level of an angel at Sequence 1 means that I can greatly resist the notice and corruption from the cosmos. I can head to the Crimson Moon and see what's happening there. Regardless of whether Mr. Door is lying or not, everything points to the fact that the Crimson Moon is the key to the problem. If I wish to become a true deity, I have to figure out the reason. I'll make preparations for another 3 more days before attempting to land on the moon. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Haha, don't quote me on that. Upon seeing this, Klein recalled the hysterical diary page of Roselle. He began to suspect that it was written after the Emperor's landing on the moon. Putting down the remaining unread diary pages, Klein began to use dream divination to recall the content he had read over the past year. He wanted to use the comparison to find clues to Roselle's abnormal mental state. Not long after, he saw a few lines of text in his dream. It was the last diary entry that was theoretically written by Roselle. I'm unable to give any actual suggestions because I myself can't see the true faces of the 7 deities or those evil gods. This might be partially related to the second blasphemy slate that the ancient organization hides. Unfortunately, one only have a rough idea of the hidden parts, and I'm unable to verify them. In this diary, the Emperor had even solemnly warned his friends to be careful of the moon. The dream suddenly shattered, and Klein snapped awake. There was an obvious look of fear in his eyes. He clearly remembered that, a long time ago, Roselle had confirmed that there was a hidden portion in the second blasphemy slate. July 19th. The night of the blood moon. Mr. Door's answer allowed me to confirm one thing. In that ancient secret organization, the second blasphemy slate I saw wasn't complete. The Emperor forgot? No. How could he have forgotten such an important matter? He only appeared a little extreme, and he didn't have much of a problem. Why did this happen? Klein couldn't help but mutter to himself silently, having an inexplicable and terrifying feeling. The last diary entry, or rather, the Emperor Roselle who wrote that sentence seemed to be another person. Chapter 1105. The key diary entry above the grayish-white that wasn't perturbed at all. Klein silently sat at the end of the long mottled table, like a stone statue that had existed for hundreds of thousands of years. Regarding the discovery he had just now, he felt a deep sense of fear from the bottom of his heart. He felt a chill rush out from the back of his head, spreading across his entire body, bringing with it obvious yet real shudders. It was as if he had witnessed a familiar friend become a stranger in a very short span of time. His actions were abnormal, as though he had been replaced by someone else. Of course, there was a clearer and more direct analogy in this aspect. It would be Leonard Mitchell coming to visit and discuss the matter regarding Pallas Zoroast as a monocle is suddenly taken out and then put on. Could it be that the Emperor was unknowingly corrupted after his ascension to the Crimson Moon, and he didn't notice it at all? He usually didn't show any abnormalities. Only through reminiscing about his past through his diary entries, analyzing his inner voice, and talking to himself would certain premonitions surface in his mind? Or could it be that this was a form of hypnosis by Adam? But Roselle was at least a Sequence 1 when that happened. Klein couldn't help but lower his head to inspect himself. He imagined how another version of himself existed in his body without realizing it. He wasn't sure if this entity could be called a human. This truly is an extreme sense of horror. Klein slowly took a deep breath and forced himself to focus his attention on the diary pages of Emperor Roselle. Soon, he discovered something worth reading. July 28th. I attended that ancient secret organization's gathering once again. From the discussions among the members, I sensed a problem. Is it because I advanced too quickly that I'm relatively inexperienced? There are many things that I have never heard of before. Just like how they mentioned about the corruption from the cosmos and underground. This is the first time I know of their existence. Heh. I wonder how many of them are he's one or she's. Apart from a minority of the members, most of them don't like others knowing their levels. While others are communicating with each other, I asked old Mr. Hermes with a whisper, hoping to understand more about the corruption that stems from the cosmos and underground. Hermes told me that this isn't something I can come into contact with at my current level. Just learning about it alone will cause me to be corrupted. It's actually that scary? What could it be? I'm even more intrigued. That old Mr. later told me that the corruption that originates from underground can be ignored because it will fade with time. A long time ago, in the era when the ancient gods were active, powerful creatures had attempted to resolve this problem completely. In the end, it made things worse and caused tremendous losses. Later, they gave up on the idea of directly exerting influence, and they switched focus to sealing and guarding it. From that day forth, although accidents happened occasionally, it was stable overall. Today, even if there are no seals or guards, as long as no one comes close and tries to go deeper, there won't be any incidents of corruption. What a surprising situation. It appears it doesn't require the protagonist of this era to resolve this problem. Old Mr. Hermes mentioned the cosmos again and said that the situation there is more complicated, interesting, and more dangerous than I imagined. He said that even a Sequence 2 angel doesn't have much knowledge of the cosmos. They only have a general understanding of it. They aren't aware that, apart from the dangers, there are too many other things. If it wasn't for the fact that he once knew an existence that was good at wandering the cosmos and learned plenty of matters from that person, he wouldn't be able to tell me all of that. I was very curious, but I didn't hold much hope when I asked about the existence who was adept at wandering the cosmos. Old Mr. Hermes didn't hide the truth. He said that it was Mr. Dorr, Bethel Abraham. Mr. Dorr. I pretended not to know anything and asked about that person's level in a very casual tone. Hermes didn't answer directly. He only said that in the fourth epoch, even angels and demigods would address him by his name in private. Those who could make everyone address them by their titles are in a small minority, of which Mr. Dorr was one of them, aside from Evernight, Storm, Earth, and the other deities. Is that so? Mr. Dorr's level really isn't low. The corruption that stems from underground will naturally fade with time? Rhodes said that the gray fog gives it a feeling that resembles that of an object from underground. It hopes that I can explore the underground world after I return to my throne of divinity. As for Luca Brewster, he's certain that the higher the sequence, the greater the danger the underground world will bring. Klein tapped the edge of the long mottled table with his fingers. He was increasingly puzzled about what was happening underground. Fortunately, Hermes's description, the state of the abandoned castle, and the attitude of the Evemite goddess seemed to indicate that the corruption that stems from underground would naturally dissipate. Leaving it alone was the best solution. Phew. Then I shall temporarily put aside my worries regarding the underground world. Hermes's words and the bronze door deep in the City of Miracles corroborate with each other. The dragon of imagination Ankwelt had really tried to resolve the problem of the underground world, but ended up with fear and trauma. From the looks of it, the greatest possibility for the coming of the apocalypse is probably from the cosmos, and my current sequence doesn't qualify me to know of it. Amidst his thoughts, Klein sighed as he continued flipping through the diary pages in his hand. After reading a few pages, his eyes suddenly lit up and locked onto one of the pages. December 31st. The end of a year is the most suitable time to make a resolution and start a new story. I've already thought of where the 8 secret mausoleums should be built. I'm just clueless about the last one. This has to be more covert than the 8 previous ones, or else it will be meaningless. After a long thought, I thought of a place. The nameless island where Grimm was buried. Of course, the abyss is also an option. However, I can't find a living devil in the area that I can enter, so I can't force them to become my citizens and help me build a mausoleum. Ordinary humans can't survive there, and even powerful beyonders will find it difficult to resist the corrosive properties of the abyss itself. Regardless, the environment on that nameless island seems like a pretty good choice. The Princes of Abolition in the Fourth Epoch's understanding of citizens is too limited. The rule of an emperor is not only limited to humans and humanoid creatures. All living things should be my subjects. And there are many extraordinary creatures on that nameless island with no intelligence. They have long worshipped and followed me. I can totally drive them into building a secret mausoleum. When I wrote this, I suddenly recalled that experience. Because I dreamed of Grimm, I brought Edwards, Benjamin, and the others back to this nameless island and discovered that those extraordinary creatures lived together in harmony. They were gathered together and holding a ritual, and amongst them was the deceased Grimm. I was indeed shocked back then. I felt a fear that I hadn't felt in a long time, and everything appeared extremely bizarre. That time, William and Polly died. Only Edwards and Benjamin survived. If I hadn't already become powerful and controlled a Grade 0 sealed artifact, everyone would have perished along with them. The power of those beyonder creatures that affected that nameless island actually came from the cosmos, and those who were corrupted would return to the source after dying. Thankfully, the power from the cosmos could only project a small portion of it into the real world. I finally solved the problem and made that nameless island my secret base. Now it's time to use it. After reading the diary, Klein didn't feel exhilarated that he had correctly guessed where Emperor Rosel's final mausoleum was. Instead, he frowned slightly. This was, on the one hand, because the corruption caused by the cosmos had truly appeared in front of him. On the other hand, the nameless island wasn't that secretive. Other than the Emperor, there were also the two survivors, Edwards and Benjamin. It didn't meet Rosel's requirements of complete secrecy. Before this, did Edwards and Benjamin pass away normally, resulting in them being unable to divulge any secrets, or was it that, after Rosel successfully built the mausoleum, he made these two subordinates stay on the island forever, resolving the problem of spirit channeling? Of course, if Rosel had the corresponding sealed artifacts or beyonder powers, he could also make them completely lose the corresponding memories. After a moment of silence, Klein flipped through the diary pages again in search of the coordinates to the nameless island. However, he didn't see the corresponding content when he reached the last page. Instead, there was a diary entry that vaguely revealed some of Rosel's thoughts in his later years. December 27th. I've been feeling uneasy recently because I have no confidence in what will happen next. I no longer yearn for help. I'm very satisfied if they can remain neutral. I have put myself in the most dangerous situation. This is an act of me taking initiative, but it is also a choice due to a lack of options. Sometimes, I'm very confused. How did I end up like this? Was I too extreme, or was this the only thing I could do? No, at this point in time, I can't be confused anymore. Apart from affecting my mindset and making the already slim chances even slimmer, it's meaningless. Now that I've reached this point, I can only continue on. If I succeed, it will naturally be sunshine and rainbows. Haha, all my hopes are placed on one sentence. Life is possible by being in death's embrace. From the looks of it, the Emperor really chose the method of making use of one's revival after death to escape the madness and corruption. This is simply crazy. It's like he's playing a game of Russian roulette with all 6 chambers filled, hoping that one of the rounds misfire. People who don't like going to the extremes, or those who are good at coming up with all kinds of strange ideas, wouldn't consider the viability of this method. Perhaps it's because the enemy can't guess it that this might give the Emperor a sliver of a chance of living. Klein leaned back into his chair as he silently sat in the ancient palace for a while. After he slowly recovered his scattered thoughts, he considered how to find the nameless island. I remember that the person who visited the nameless island, Benjamin, seems to be from the Abraham family. This be asked via Miss Magician. Yes, I'll be meeting her soon. There's no need to specially get the fool to pass the message. I'll get Queen Mystic to ask the descendants of Edwards, William, and Polly. That will be more suitable. With this in mind, he surveyed the area and sighed before disappearing above the gray fog. Chapter 1106 Making Contact. Returning to the real world, Klein immediately took out a pen and paper and wrote a short letter. Investigate the nameless island which led to the deaths of Grimm, William, and Polly. This can be done through the descendants of Edwards, Benjamin Abraham, and the descendants of the 3 deceased. This was a letter to Queen Mystic Bernadette, so Klein didn't write the reason. He believed that she would understand what this meant. After folding the letter, Klein casually found a candle and began the summoning ritual. After completing the setup, he placed the letter on the altar, took 2 steps back, and recited in ancient Hermes, I summon in my name, an invisible creature that roams the upper realms, a strange spiritual body that is friendly to humans, a messenger that belongs solely to Bernadette Gustave. The moment he said that, Klein's spiritual perception was triggered. He instinctively activated his spirit vision with a mere thought. However, he didn't see anything. Then, he discovered that the letter placed on the altar had disappeared. Queen Mystic's messenger is very special. Next time, I'll switch to using my spirit body threads vision. Klein was stunned for a second before he sighed inwardly. In the evening, under the illumination of the street lamps that lit up one after another, a carriage drove to the intersection of the Backlund Bridge area and East Borough and stopped by the side of the streets. Wearing a long dress and a dark cloak, Furs paid the fare of 3 solely before alighting from the rental carriage. She walked slowly along the shadows of the street, preparing to make a large detour to escape from her imaginary stalker. At the end of the previous tarot gathering, she had swiftly overcome her laziness, packed up, and went out to visit her former teachers, classmates, and colleagues. As for the reason, there was no need for a special reason. It was very normal to care about friends and acquaintances after an air raid. And the reason why it wasn't last week was because, in the eyes of the ordinary citizens, the situation in Backland was especially tense. There could be a new round of attacks at any moment, so everyone naturally tried their best not to leave the house. During the visit, Furs had originally planned on diverting the topic onto the strange tales at the hospital, but to her surprise, there was no need for her to do so at all. Her former teachers, classmates and colleagues would usually chat about such matters on their own accord after some idle chatter, making one convinced that such illusions happened at every hospital. No, Furs knew that it wasn't an illusion, so she inexplicably felt horrified, suspecting that she would have nightmares at night. I don't have to make any major changes at all. As long as the patient's miraculous recoveries are changed to them having their physical wounds healed, only to have them go bonkers, it would make for an excellent horror story. Furthermore, it happens in a city that everyone is familiar with and also in the hospital that people often come into contact with in the city but exudes a terrifying atmosphere. It will result in perfect immersion. I can almost foresee another best-selling novel about to be BOM. I just don't know if I can write this genre well. The only problem is that this story will lack sufficient emotion. A female patient passionately kissing a face that's covered in mushrooms and weeds? Isn't that way too outlandish? Furs walked as she thought, entering a creative state of mind. At this moment, her vision blurred. She saw a figure walk out from the shadows in front of her where the gas lamps couldn't illuminate. The figure wore a black trench coat and a half-top hat. He had a deep-set face with cold facial features. Apart from his gold-rimmed glasses, he looked identical to the crazy adventurer of the 5 Seas, Gehrman Sparrow. Although Furs knew that Mr. World wouldn't hunt her and was here to fulfill the contract, she couldn't help but tense up. It was as though she had met her strictest teacher from back in her school days. Good evening. Her footsteps slowed down, but she still continued moving forward and greeted him. Klein nodded without a word. He turned around and walked into a secluded alley to the side. The gas lamps inside were already damaged, so it was dark. Despite the dark environment, Furs similarly didn't say a word. She lowered her head slightly and followed behind Gehrman Sparrow at an adequate pace. When they reached the depths of the alley, Klein looked around and said in a deep voice, "Help me ask your teacher if he knows of this person, Benjamin Abraham. If he knows him, I want all his information and all the text and pictures he left behind." Okay. Furs was nervously waiting for Mr. World to teleport her somewhere else, but she never expected him to mention something else for no reason. She nearly failed to react. She didn't ask why and quickly nodded in agreement, as though she couldn't wait to do it. Then, she took a deep breath and continued waiting for Gehrman Sparrow to approach her. He grabbed her shoulder and began teleporting. But after a few seconds, nothing happened. Furs looked up in shock, only to see Mr. World still standing in front of her, looking at her. She then heard him say in a deep voice, "Write it now. Write it now." Furs didn't ask why as she subconsciously said, "I didn't bring any paper, a pen, envelope, or stamp with me." Before she could finish her sentence, the 4 items were thrown at her. Furs caught the items and took a few steps out. Using the gas lamps at the end of the alley which opened up to the roads and the hard wall, she quickly wrote the letter to her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham. With both hands in his pockets, Klein waited patiently without any signs of impatience. In fact, he had long been lurking around Miss Magician without showing himself. According to the address Furs provided, he had been secretly monitoring her from the moment she left home in the afternoon. His monitoring was done by getting his marionettes to pray to see God Calvetua from time to time while his actual body stayed above the gray fog, using the prayer light dots to observe the situation around the magician. With the help of his true vision, Klein was currently certain that Zeratul hadn't targeted Miss Magician. Thus, it was safe to make contact with her. After knowing that Miss Magician had met Zeratul's marionette, how could he be at ease and be daring enough to meet her and take her traveling? Now, he was certain that Zeratul had been attracted by the Abraham family's sealed artifact or Saint of Secrets boties. As for a mere sequence 6 like the magician, she wasn't worthy of notice. Hence, she wasn't exposed. A few minutes later, Furs finished writing. She used a sticky herbal powder she carried with her to seal the envelope and pasted the stamp. "Do I throw it into the mailbox now?" Furs glanced at the cover of the letter with her teacher's address and real name and asked hesitantly. She felt that she had to do it herself. She couldn't hand it over to the world, or it might bring danger to her teacher. Of course, if Gehrman Sparrow insisted, Furs felt that there was nothing she could do. Even if she tore the letter apart, there was still a possibility of her being hypnotized or having her spirit channeled. Klein nodded indiscernibly. Return after you're finished posting it. Phew. Furs let out a long sigh of relief. Turning around, she ran towards the street and found the mailbox. After finishing all of this, she returned to the dark alley. Without waiting for Gehrman Sparrow to speak, she handed over the fountain pen and the remaining 2 stamps. She very quickly said, "One was enough." Klein gave Miss Magician a look before he took the stamp and pen and calmly said, "This means that your teacher's residence is less than 100 kilometers from Backlund." Furz's expression froze. "What's the big deal? I also know that your teacher lives in Pritz Harbor, and there's a high chance that he hasn't moved away yet. As for why I gave you 3 stamp tickets, of course it was intentional." Klein muttered to himself before taking a few steps forward to stand in front of Miss Magician. He then reached out his left hand that was wearing a transparent glove and grabbed the lady's shoulder. Fur subconsciously lowered her head again. The surrounding colors immediately became saturated and layered while countless, indescribable figures flashed. When the things and colors she saw returned to normal, Furs instinctively raised her head to thank him. However, Gehrman Sparrow had already disappeared. Furs sized up her surroundings in a daze and realized that she was standing in an empty corner. In front of her was a door, and a din and the smell of alcohol were emitted from beyond the door. Furs pulled at her cloak and walked out the door with a hint of fear, only to see many men dressed as pirates. They had scimitars and guns, either hanging or lodged by their waist. While drinking hard liquor, they discussed the strengths of the fleets of Faysac and Lone in high spirits. Quite a number of beautifully dressed women were amongst them, like dancing butterflies. She was wearing a long, dark-colored cloak in a Backlund style. Her brown hair was long and slightly curled. She had a rather mature temperament, but her expression of fear made it seem like Furs was a lamb that had barged into a wolf pack. It was so disharmonious and eye-catching, and it quickly attracted the attention of many. She felt a little familiar with what those people had said to her. It was as if they were part of a language branch she had learned, but she couldn't understand them immediately. Where am I? What am I doing? Who are they? As Furs was at a loss, a plump man squeezed over and said in broken Loanese, 10 soli 1 night. Furs had been involved in many of the Beyonder circles over the years. Although she didn't know where she was, she knew very well what kind of situation she was in. The light in her eyes flickered strangely before they converged into one point. An indescribable aura emanated from her body, making the people around her subconsciously avoid her gaze. This was the authority of a judge, a qualitative change in the ability of an arbiter. Berserk Sea. Theros Island. Danitz hid in the shadows, watching the intelligence peddler, Bartz, in a serious manner. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.